Welcome back again. Please comment down below what time it is right now wherever you are, and like the video. It's very important for the algorithm. Thank you. Let's get to it. On January 15, 1947, a mother walking with her child in Los Angeles spotted what she thought was a broken mannequin in an empty lot. But it wasn't plastic. It was the severed body of 22-year-old Elizabeth Short, posed in a way that still shocks investigators today. Who could have carried out such a calculated and grotesque crime, and why leave her displayed for anyone to find? Tonight, we begin with that haunting discovery, tracing how the Black Dahlia became one of America's most enduring mysteries. On the morning of January 15th, 1947, a woman named Betty Bersinger was walking along Norton Avenue in Los Angeles with her young daughter. It was an ordinary routine, just a quiet stroll in the neighborhood, when she noticed something unusual in the vacant lot across the street. What caught her eye first was the pale figure lying in the grass. At a glance, she assumed it was a store mannequin broken in half and discarded, something left behind by someone careless. In the daylight, the figure's white appearance gave the sense of plastic or porcelain, but taking a closer look, the horror of what she had seen began to settle in. This was no mannequin. It was a woman's body, cut in two, left exposed for anyone passing by to see. The sight stopped her in shock. She gathered herself and hurried away, her daughter still with her, moving quickly to call the police. That phone call would set in motion one of the most infamous investigations in Los Angeles history. Within a short time, officers arrived at the location along the sidewalk of Norton Avenue. What they found would raise questions not just for them, but for the city at large. The body was positioned deliberately, separated cleanly into two sections, the torso and the legs lower down in the grass. Elizabeth Short, although not yet identified at the time, was lying there fully exposed, and for the detectives first on the scene, the odd composition of the body immediately suggested that someone had intended for it to be discovered. At first, even the police hesitated. The scene was so strange it looked staged. People wondered if decomposition could explain the pale, almost wax-like appearance of the skin. Others pointed to the lack of blood around the area as evidence that the crime had taken place elsewhere. Normally, a violent death leaves marks on the ground, blood, signs of struggle. Here, there was nothing. The surface of the grass was clean. For investigators, this absence was as alarming as the mutilation itself. It meant that the body had been washed, drained, and transported after death. Whoever did this had taken time and put thought into arrangement, not simply disposal. Adding to the disturbing nature were the details of how the body was posed. The arms of the victim were lifted and bent in stark angles, and the legs were arranged several inches away from the torso. In one of the most haunting elements, part of her lower organs, including her intestines, had been carefully tucked back underneath her body. That act could not be mistaken for chance. It suggested a form of staging, a deliberate act with meaning only the person responsible would know. Detectives understood that such a presentation was meant to shock, to leave an impression. Witnesses in the area soon gathered. As word spread of the grisly discovery, onlookers tried to make sense of what they saw. Some still whispered that maybe it really was a mannequin, as their minds searched for any explanation other than murder. For an ordinary passerby, the sharp cuts looked so precise that it was hard to imagine this had been done by anyone without skill. The clean division of the body raised immediate speculation among both witnesses and the responding officers. Could this act have been committed by someone with medical training? That question would echo throughout the case for years. Within the hour, the crime scene filled with more officers, detectives, and curious members of the public. Reporters were not far behind, tipped off by the scanner calls of something strange unfolding on Norton Avenue. The area itself was not secluded. The lot was open, visible from the street in broad daylight. Detectives determined that the placement of the corpse had been intentional. The killer had not hidden the body in an alleyway or buried it in a remote field. They had displayed it, laying it out in a space where neighbors, pedestrians, and eventually police could not miss it. For many, that was one of the most unsettling aspects of the entire situation. The killer had turned their crime into a statement. Police, already under pressure to take immediate action, roped off the area and began their first documentation. Photographers recorded the strange sight, while investigators combed the surrounding ground for any clue of how the body arrived. They searched for tire tracks, footprints, scraps of fabric, and anything else disturbed within the soil and weeds. Very little turned up that day. It seemed the killer had chosen the spot carefully. There was no sign of a struggle in the lot itself, reinforcing the theory that Short had been murdered and mutilated elsewhere, and then her remains transported to Norton Avenue. The The precise condition of the body made clear to investigators that this was not simply an act of rage. The cuts were too exact, straight and even, with no jagged tearing. The empty whiteness of the skin showed she had been drained of blood. These details created a strange duality for everyone at the scene. On the one hand, it looked like something out of a medical demonstration, as if a dissection had been performed with professional precision. On the other hand, the posing of the arms and the hidden intestines showed symbolism, theatre, the signature of someone who wanted to disturb, even terrify. Neighbours gave statements and described how they had not noticed anything unusual in the hours leading up to the discovery. No screams, no sounds of struggle, no vehicles remembered stopping at the vacant lot during the night. That deepened the mystery. How had the killer moved a body there in the dark without anyone noticing? And why leave her lying so visibly on private land that faced a public street? Whatever the reasoning, it shocked not just detectives but every person who heard of it. As the day continued, crowds grew around the taped-off field. Curious locals gathered in increasing numbers, staring toward the cordoned grass where uniformed officers tried to keep them back. The police worked against time to remove the remains before the throngs of onlookers and press magnified the chaos. Yet, in doing so, they already faced one devastating factor. The intrusion of outside parties at the scene risked contaminating potential evidence. Reporters walked dangerously close, neighborhood residents recounted their recollections openly, and children whispered nervously on the sidewalks. Even in this earlier stage, control of the crime scene seemed fragile. That afternoon, detectives reached a firm conclusion. This was one of the most horrifying murders Los Angeles had ever faced. The staging of the body, the surgical nature of the cuts, and the chosen location presented a crime that was not only violent but deeply intentional. This was not a murder of passion left behind in panic. It was an act of planning, even performance. The motivation was unknown, but the impact would be undeniable. Overnight, Elizabeth Short's body ceased to be a faceless discovery and became the center of a case that would dominate the city's attention. The broken mannequin was, in fact, the opening chapter of the story remembered as the Black Dahlia murder. From that moment, authorities rushed to interpret not only what had been done, but who was capable of doing it. Within a single day of Elizabeth Short's body being found, the details of the crime were not just whispered across Los Angeles, they were splashed across front pages nationwide. The press moved quickly, rushing reporters to the scene and filling columns with descriptions that emphasized horror over fact. In an era when newspapers fought fiercely for readership, crime stories like this one were not just news, they were commodities. The coverage had a rhythm, fast-moving and dramatic, designed to grab attention before a rival paper got in first. And with the Black Dahlia, they had a story unlike anything else at the time. A young woman murdered in a way that seemed almost too bizarre to be real. Elizabeth Short herself was not known nationally before her death. She had lived a transient life, mostly known to acquaintances, moving in and out of Los Angeles while working occasional jobs. But reporters painted a different picture. In articles, she was cast as a mysterious would-be actress who spent her nights drifting through Hollywood clubs. In truth, records and testimony from friends showed she had not secured acting roles, and her lifestyle reflected something closer to instability than glamour. Yet the need to make the story sell shaped the way she was presented. Readers were not encouraged to ask who she actually was. Instead, they were invited into a neatly crafted image of a dark-haired starlet cut down before her eyes. The nickname itself appeared almost immediately. The Black Dahlia first showed up in headlines, not from her friends or family, but from reporters looking to brand the case with something memorable. There had been a popular film released the previous year, The Blue Dahlia, and the similarity was convenient. Short's preference for dressing in black clothing gave an easy hook to connect. The nickname stuck so quickly that within hours of its first appearance, it was as if she had never been Elizabeth Short at all. In death, her real identity was already being overshadowed by the media creation of the Black Dahlia. That early coverage leaned less on police statements and more on lurid speculation. Papers focused on her drinking, her clothing, and hints at her social life, portraying her as a woman immersed in a nightlife of clubs and men. While police were still trying to figure out the most basic facts, where she had been living, where she had last been seen, some stories filled in blanks with rumor. Editors knew these details captured attention. They presented her not as someone struggling with poverty or uncertainty, but as a figure tied to excess and danger, feeding into stereotypes already attached to Hollywood. This was not only news reporting, it was framing. Elizabeth Short was described in headlines as a temptress, a secretive woman who may have been leading a double life. Almost none of that came from verified facts. Instead, It fit neatly into the post-war appetite for stories about fallen women and the price of ambition. In the late 1940s, American readers consumed crime news at a scale that often turned real lives into serialized dramas. And on this stage, Short became the perfect subject. Young, attractive, tied to Hollywood by proximity, and murdered in a way that demanded further reading. Readers could not look away, and editors knew they had captured a tale that went beyond ordinary homicide. It is worth understanding the climate of journalism at the time. Los Angeles newspapers were not just reporting for accuracy, they were competing against one another for circulation. The Los Angeles Examiner, the Herald Express, and the Los Angeles Times each sought exclusives, often pushing to exaggerate or rush details without proper backing. Front pages cycled new theories daily. Some of the earliest write-ups emphasized gruesome surgical details before official reports were even finalized. Others used suggestive photos of Short, cropped or staged to fit the idea she had been living dangerously. In many cases, those portrayals bore little resemblance to her financial struggles or her habit of drifting between rooming houses. The divide between her reality and her image only widened as the weeks went on. People who knew her personally often described her as shy, sometimes evasive about her plans, and unable to find steady work, but almost no one reading those papers encountered that description. Instead, what they encountered was the shadow figure of the Black Dahlia, mysterious, provocative, and tied to the underworld of Los Angeles nightlife. Once that picture had been painted, it was difficult for the public to see her as anything else. The use of visuals was also important. Photographs of her from earlier years were edited, her hair emphasized in darker tones, her clothing highlighted to capture the noir mood of Hollywood. Her murder was the horror, but her image was what sold the papers. In this way, the press transformed her from a person to a symbol, the embodiment of Los Angeles danger, tucked in between the war years and the rise of Hollywood stardom. Readers consumed her as part of the city's myth, not as a 22-year-old who had written letters to her family apologizing for her instability. And because most readers only knew her through the press, that fictional version became the accepted truth. For journalists, lurid details took precedence because they drew in readers in ways verified reports often did not. It mattered less if information was incomplete. A mysterious nickname, an unnamed witness, or the mere hint that she had been seen with men of influence carried more value on a front page than a factual correction later on. Each paper sought to outdo the next, so restraint disappeared. One outlet emphasized the cuts on her body. Another stretched claims of supposed connections to film studios, while still another suggested unsavory rumors about her lifestyle. This cycle of embellishment amplified the case and spread the legend far beyond California. By highlighting her supposed secrets, the coverage blurred the line between victim and spectacle. Elizabeth Short was no longer presented as a young woman killed brutally, but as a figure in a darker story about Hollywood ambition. The more mysterious and scandalous her portrayal became, the more it seemed to justify the label of the Black Dahlia. That narrative, more than any investigative finding, solidified her place in crime history. In reality, she had been scraping by with limited resources, working as a waitress and relying on temporary arrangements to survive in the city. But to newspaper readers in 1947, she was represented as a doomed femme fatale, a Hollywood beauty destroyed on the edges of fame. The public appetite for such stories was enormous in the late 1940s. After the Second World War, readers looked for distractions, and sensational crime filled that role. Papers encouraged the trend because sales numbers reflected it. Each shocking headline guaranteed higher circulation. The result was predictable. Elizabeth Short's death was not just one story among many. It became a feeding frenzy. Within weeks, articles had shifted attention away from the search for her killer and toward continuous speculation about her lifestyle. What was missed in that exchange was the fuller picture of who she truly was. This transformation turned Elizabeth Short's murder into more than an unsolved crime. It became an enduring story shaped by the press itself. While detectives were trying to collect timelines and autopsy findings, newspaper covers had already written their conclusion about who the Black Dahlia had been. That divide between narrative and reality mattered because it complicated the police effort from the start. Investigators not only had to chase facts, they also had to battle myths that were being printed daily. As weeks passed, the lines blurred so far that separating truth from invention was almost impossible. That was the environment detectives walked into as they tried to solve the murder of Elizabeth Short. Who was Elizabeth Short in the days leading up to her death? That question became central to investigators almost immediately after her body was identified. To understand what may have happened, police tried to reconstruct her daily movements. Yet what they found was not a simple, consistent story. Instead, her final days exposed a life marked by instability and secrecy, the kind of drifting existence that made her vulnerable in a city as sprawling and indifferent as Los Angeles in the mid-1940s. She lived mostly in rooming houses, moving frequently from one location to another, and often relied on acquaintances for short stays when money ran dry. At times, she worked as a waitress, but steady income often slipped away. Her life in those last weeks showed resilience, but also patterns of uncertainty, the kind that made it easy to lose track of where she was or who she was with. Friends described her as charming but secretive, someone who kept her movements close. When asked where she was headed, she often provided unclear answers, or none at all. That repeated pattern created frustration among acquaintances and left police with scattered reports that often conflicted. She cultivated social connections but guarded her real situation, perhaps to maintain an image, or to avoid admitting how unstable her circumstances had become. This secrecy, chosen or not, became critical when detectives tried to retrace her steps after January 9th. That date marked the last confirmed sighting of her while alive. She had been seen with a man named Robert "Red" Manley, a married salesman from Los Angeles. Manley had met her weeks earlier and had been providing her transportation. On January 9th, he dropped her off at the Biltmore Hotel downtown. Witnesses there confirmed she spent time in the hotel lobby, appearing to wait for someone, but staff recalled she eventually left. From that moment, accounts diverged. Some suggested she had arranged to meet another acquaintance. Others claimed she was sighted elsewhere in the city on later nights, but none of those later reports were verified. The Biltmore became the last reliable setting where she was known to be. That gap in time created lasting uncertainty. Between the late hours of January 9th and the discovery of her body on January 15th, 6 full days passed without confirmed sightings. It was in that gap that her fate was determined, but reconstructing it became impossible. People came forward with stories of seeing her at bars or clubs during that time, and each report carried just enough plausibility to distract investigators. But when tested, they could not be tied directly to her. Even the timeline offered by Manley was later scrutinized, though he maintained consistency in statements. Elizabeth Short's name had also appeared in social circles linked to Los Angeles nightlife. One of her noted acquaintances was Mark Hansen, who co-owned the Florentine Gardens nightclub. People who knew both said she stayed with Hansen at times, though not in a romantic sense, despite his interest in her. Witness Ann Toth told detectives that Short had rejected Hansen's advances. Rejections like these, especially during that period, frequently caused tension. Short's life often brought her into the orbit of men who offered assistance but expected something in return. Saying no could leave resentment, particularly among those with influence or resources. Hansen remained a person of interest for years, in part because of the proximity and his inclusion in her circle. The challenge for investigators was untangling how deeply intertwined she had been with these men. Many told detectives they had known her casually, others described fleeting interactions. But in a city already associated with nightclubs, hopeful actresses, and men in powerful positions, the environment itself fueled speculation. That was the same environment the press drew on when constructing her image as the Black Dahlia. For police, however, each relationship had to be examined as potential motive, whether grounded in jealousy, rejection, or exploitation. One clear pattern, across accounts of her social life in Los Angeles, was the imbalance between men in positions of financial security and her own unstable resources. She often relied on others for help, and that created situations where expectations clashed. Rejecting those advances could lead to strained dynamics. Investigators recorded tension in that fact. It made them consider whether an emotional break or anger at being turned away might have played into her ending. But without hard evidence, those questions remained only theories. The reality of her day-to-day living conditions exposed how vulnerable she was in that city. In the 1940s, Los Angeles grew quickly, swelling with returning veterans, new industries, and steady waves of newcomers. Many came seeking opportunities tied to entertainment or war-related work. Among them were young women like Short, who faced high rents, limited employment options, and unstable housing. To survive, many shared crowded rooms, shifted often between rooming houses, and adapted however possible. Within that pattern, it was common to meet strangers, borrow trust, and risk exposure to harm. Elizabeth Short represented that transience. She wrote to her mother and family in Massachusetts, often, usually downplaying her struggles, but the constant movement showed how uneven her grounding was. Rooming houses required payment up front, and when her funds ran low, she shifted. Her reliance on others placed her in precarious positions, sometimes dependent on acquaintances whose kindness could end abruptly. Police saw these details as unavoidable in shaping her path to danger. By the time detectives reconstructed her final movements, her secrecy, her casual connections, and her transient living conditions revealed both a portrait of independence and vulnerability. She had ambitions. She attempted to maintain poise and appearance, but she faced constant struggles under the surface. The last verified sighting at the Biltmore Hotel highlighted that instability most clearly. Who she expected to meet, and whether that meeting occurred, became unanswered questions marking the start of her disappearance. As police closed in on that timeline, every detail seemed to matter. Each recollection of her secrecy from friends, each reference to disputes with acquaintances, shaped how they approached possible suspects. But the absence of solid evidence created doubt at every turn. What her last days revealed was not clarity, but 1,000 fragmented accounts, each slightly different from the last. The reality was that in a city filled with thousands of people moving quickly, 6 days could hold endless possibilities. And the pressure on investigators only increased when autopsy results made the mystery even harder to face. The autopsy of Elizabeth Short, conducted shortly after her body was brought to the Los Angeles County morgue, revealed findings even more disturbing than the discovery of her remains in the field. Dr. Frederick Newbar, the coroner who carried out the examination, faced a task unlike anything seen in the city at the time. His report provided the first official documentation of the extent of her injuries, and it was through his analysis that police learned just how deliberate and skillful the mutilation had been. One of the most striking findings was that Short's body had been completely drained of blood before being abandoned in the lot. It was this absence that explained the pale, wax-like quality of her skin that witnesses had mistaken for a mannequin. For investigators, the detail was chilling because it showed a level of control. Blood loss of that scale could not have happened naturally at the scene. It proved the killing had taken place elsewhere, with time and space for the killer to manage the remains without interruption. The clinical condition of her body was unlike the usual aftermath of violent crime. The clean separation of her torso from her legs confirmed what had been suspected at the crime scene. The autopsy revealed that the division had been executed with precise, straight cuts. Dr. Newbar noted that the dissection followed a medical technique known to surgeons at the time, one rarely seen outside of a hospital or training environment. It was not the work of a hurried or untrained hand. This precision convinced detectives that the suspect might have medical knowledge, leading them to consider doctors, medical students, or lab technicians as potential suspects. The cuts were deliberate, carried out using skill rather than brute force. Equally disturbing was the discovery of mutilation to Short's face. She had been cut from each corner of her mouth outward toward her ears, creating what is now often referred to as a Glasgow smile. The mutilation ensured her death would not only be remembered as violent, but also marked by cruelty. For investigators, this detail carried a weight beyond physical evidence. It suggested her killer wanted to send a message or produce an image designed to horrify anyone who saw her. Paired with the public staging of her body, it presented not only violence but intentional display. Other markings on her body showed evidence of restraint. Autopsy notes recorded deep ligature marks around her wrists and ankles, and additional blunt force trauma was found on her body. These signs indicated that she had been tied during at least part of the ordeal. The abrasions and cuts were consistent with being restrained for a prolonged period, which confirmed to detectives that she had been held alive before her death, rather than killed quickly. The context suggested not just physical domination, but also time spent under the control of her killer. Tests were also conducted to address whether she had been sexually assaulted. While some evidence raised suspicion, the results were inconclusive. That uncertainty left investigators without the ability to confirm one of the most likely motives for why she had been taken. At a time when forensic methods were far less advanced than those available today, the inability to confirm or deny assault limited what police could build into their case. It underscored the gaps in forensic tools during the late 1940s, when questions as vital as motive could remain unanswered. Perhaps the most important medical finding was the determination of her actual cause of death. While the dismemberment was grotesque, Dr. Newbar concluded that it had not killed her. Instead, the clean surgical cutting had been done after her death. Examination showed her fatal injuries were the result of blunt force trauma to the head, coupled with extensive blood loss. Hemorrhaging consistent with a heavy strike overwhelmed her body. It meant she may have remained alive, bound and beaten, before the precise mutilation was carried out following her death. This conclusion clarified that while the staging had shocked the city, the true violence came from an initial lethal blow, combined with blood loss, leading to shock. Understanding the timeline of violence recast the entire case. It shifted focus toward who could not only kill her in such a manner, but then take the time and skill to create a scene afterward. Detectives reviewing Dr. Newbar's findings began building a profile that leaned heavily on the possibility of advanced knowledge. The separation of the body, according to anatomical landmarks, was a clear indicator to them. Many believed that only someone with surgical training, or at least extensive experience in anatomy, could execute such cuts so cleanly. As a result, police quickly reached out for lists of medical students at local universities, particularly the University of Southern California, and began interviewing doctors across the city. These conclusions also fueled the growing frenzy in the press. As details from the autopsy leaked, speculation turned toward the idea of a doctor killer, someone with education and skill using knowledge in a grotesque way. Local papers ran headlines pointing to medical precision, insinuating that the city's own professionals might be capable of secret cruelty. This framing both alarmed and fascinated readers, adding fuel to the already sensationalized coverage. Detectives, in turn, faced heavier pressure to investigate the physicians and interns who once might never have been considered suspects. The autopsy also magnified debate about motive. If the killer had been medically trained, was the dismemberment part of some form of twisted curiosity, or was it simply a practical way of transporting her body? Was the facial cut a sign of revenge, or symbolic violence reflecting more personal intent? These questions outpaced answers. What was clear was that the procedures carried out on her body were not improvised. They were intentional, exact, and implemented with confidence. That confidence, more than any other single detail, defined much of the theory building around the profile of the killer. Despite the clinical conclusions, the report did not bring clarity to the investigation. It added new weight, showing how advanced skill may have been involved, which expanded the suspect pool in ways detectives struggled to manage. While dozens of medical professionals were questioned, no firm suspect was ever pinpointed from that lead. Yet in the court of public opinion, the association of her murder with medical expertise became one of the first lasting narratives tied to the case. By the time forensic examiners signed off on their reports, police knew one fact beyond debate. Whoever murdered Elizabeth Short did not leave behind a random tragedy. The exacting mutilation, the clean division of her body, and the evidence of restraint before her death painted a picture of intent. This was a killer who had taken steps to control every aspect of the crime. While the staging of her body shocked the community, the forensic detail created a new fear. The thought that the person responsible for such calculated violence had knowledge, skill, and potentially a sense of invulnerability. The findings of Dr. Newbar's examination steered the investigation toward one category of suspect above all others: those with specialized training, people who might otherwise never have faced suspicion. The gruesome precision changed the direction of the case, sharpening the suspicion that this was no ordinary killer. But within days of the autopsy, a different and even stranger development occurred. Someone began reaching out directly to the press, as if the killer had just begun speaking. Within a week of Elizabeth Short's body being discovered, newspapers in Los Angeles claimed something startling was happening. The killer, they said, had begun contacting them directly. At a time when the city was still reeling from the brutality of the murder, the idea that whoever had done it was reading news coverage and then responding to it created fear. Authorities already suspected the case would attract countless false tips, but now they faced the unnerving possibility of a killer intent on shaping the story himself. The first sign came through a phone call placed to the Los Angeles Examiner. A man told the newspaper that he was responsible for Elizabeth Short's death. He promised to send in some of her belongings to prove his claim. It was a short call, but clear enough to gain immediate attention. Reporters had already been sensationalizing the murder, yet if the call proved real, their paper would be in direct contact with the person behind the crime. Detectives quickly learned of the call and stood by for confirmation. Within days, something arrived to back up the caller's claim. A package reached the examiner's office with a collection of items that could only have come from Elizabeth Short herself. Among the contents were her birth certificate, photographs, business cards, and personal papers. The most notable possession was a small black address book that contained names and numbers connected to her social circle. For police, the mailing confirmed that the caller had not been bluffing. In addition to the gruesome crime scene, the killer, or someone with direct access to her belongings, was now inserting himself into the investigation. Examiners handling the package noticed something more troubling. Every item had been wiped clean with gasoline. This step, crude but effective, had been used to remove potential fingerprints. The smell was still present. It meant whoever prepared the package understood police procedure. At least, enough to know that forensic testing could link an object to them. While some items still carried partial impressions, they were smudged, and careless handling during the frantic recovery destroyed any usable trace. What could have been the first solid lead dissolved the moment the goods were touched without a forensic plan in place. At a time when crime scene procedure was less advanced and media presence interfered regularly, the error reflected a larger problem facing the LAPD. The address book became a central focus. Investigators studied it closely, finding the name Mark Hansen among the entries. Hansen, the nightclub owner with whom Elizabeth Short had once stayed, would eventually become one of the main figures of suspicion. But the fact that such a personal item had been sent through the mail created troubling questions. Was this truly from the killer, or was it someone hoping to appear involved by mailing the stolen property? Because the book contained both important names and vague contacts, it introduced as many questions as answers. Identity items inside the mailing strengthened the impression that whoever sent it had a direct connection. Police confirmed the belongings were authentic. Yet, despite the potential breakthrough, the gasoline cleaning and mishandling left investigators without physical evidence. They had the taunts of a possible killer, personal property mailed in as a demonstration, and still no actual proof pointing to who had handled any of it. After the package, letters began appearing. Written in a clipped, mocking style, they seemed to refer to the case, and sometimes used cut-out newspaper words pasted onto paper. While the media highlighted them as direct communications from the murderer, detectives quietly doubted their origin. The letters contained little information unknown to the public. Almost everything referenced could have been picked up by reading the press. But because the first package held genuine belongings, it was impossible to dismiss later communications without thorough review. This tension between authentic connection and imitation grew over time. For the press, the letters and package were a new goldmine. Coverage shifted from simply recounting the details of the crime to printing supposed communications from the killer. Headlines announced taunts, challenges, and warnings, each one presented as provocative evidence that the murderer wanted recognition. Readers devoured it. Some believed they were watching a criminal mastermind toy with authorities. Others saw it as a sign that the case was bigger than the LAPD could manage. In living rooms across Los Angeles, people speculated over breakfast about whether the day's paper contained the killer's latest word. Detectives, however, knew the reality was more complicated. False confessions and misleading claims were already overwhelming their resources. The arrival of the package demonstrated at least some level of involvement, yet everything that followed blurred the focus of the case. Sorting genuine leads from attention-seeking noise consumed their time, and as resources spread thin, the certainty of identifying the murderer slipped further away. The gasoline-wiped belongings stood as proof of careful preparation. The letters, on the other hand, may have been pure theatre. Even with those doubts, the chilling effect of the communications could not be overlooked. For the family and friends of Elizabeth Short, seeing her belongings returned through the mail served as a brutal reminder of her vulnerability, now exposed to the public. For the city, it showed a killer, or at least someone claiming to be, who had the confidence to mock police by playing directly with the press. The public display mirrored the crime scene itself. Staged, provocative, and meant to control perception. Behind closed doors, investigators discussed what kind of person would take these steps. Mailing items to a newspaper instead of the police suggested someone who not only cared about attention, but also studied how the press had shaped the story. It was as if the same hand that staged Short's body for discovery now staged her identity in headlines. By inserting himself again and again, the individual responsible elevated the killing into a performance. Whether this truly was the killer, or a fraud, remained unsettled. Detectives admitted the possibility of someone who had access to her belongings without being the murderer. Loaned possessions, theft, or even a contact within her circle could explain how the items changed hands. But the level of detail and the gasoline cleaning gave weight to the claims. Any outsider capable of staging such a mailing had knowledge, and that left open the possibility that Short's killer was someone close enough to her life to handle private items with ease. By the end of January 1947, the investigation was no longer only about finding who killed Elizabeth Short. It was also about determining whether the voice now speaking through phone calls, packages, and anonymous letters belonged to the same person who had mutilated her body. Whoever was responsible had transformed the case into a dialogue between police, press, and public. The moment Short's items arrived in that parcel, the murder became more than an unsolved killing. It became a mystery, haunted by a presence that refused to disappear. As the pressure mounted, detectives were forced to look not just at the communications, but at the names in that address book. and the people who drifted through Elizabeth Short's orbit. It was inside that circle, they reasoned, where the answer might hide. When investigators turned to Elizabeth Short's companions in the days before her death, one man stood out above the rest. His name was Mark Hansen, a nightclub owner whose business connected him with entertainers, musicians, and the regular faces of Hollywood nightlife. Hansen's name appeared in the address book, mailed to the Los Angeles Examiner, one of the belongings sent after Short's murder. For police, that made him someone who could not be ignored. The mailing tied him to her circle. But there was more. A witness offered a personal detail. Short had reportedly rejected Hansen's advances not long before she was killed. That information came from Ann Toth, who had lived in the same home where Short occasionally stayed. According to Toth, Hansen made it clear he was interested in Short, and she turned him down. Rejection in itself was not a crime. But detectives noted how personal tensions often escalated when a man felt brushed aside. Hansen was wealthy, managed a popular Los Angeles club, and drew social power from the people who passed through his doors. He was accustomed to control, both in business and in relationships. Investigators considered whether that sense of control might have turned into resentment toward Short. At the time, Hansen had every reason to be on the radar. His Florentine Gardens nightclub was legendary in Hollywood circles. It was a place where hopeful performers and well-connected men came together, where dancers, waitresses, and musicians mixed with film industry personalities. Hansen himself was deeply tied to that world, giving him both social reach and an air of authority. For someone like Elizabeth Short, who often drifted among acquaintances and relied on others for temporary shelter, Hansen's home represented security. She had lived in his house, off and on, but the relationship never became what he wanted it to be. Police took note of that detail carefully. In questioning, Hansen provided alibis to account for his whereabouts around the time of Short's disappearance. None of his stories contained a direct contradiction investigators could exploit, yet none could fully clear him either. Suspicion hung in the air, but certainty remained absent. Authorities considered keeping him under closer watch, but they lacked enough to hold him. His influence in nightlife, his home hosting Short, and his appearance in the mailed address book all made him stand out. But the absence of direct evidence left him in a frustrating middle ground for investigators. As detectives pressed further into Short's background, they realized how many men had crossed paths with her in the months leading up to her death. The transient way she lived meant she formed new acquaintances quickly, but often without deep or lasting trust. LAPD spent weeks cross-examining dozens of men who had either been romantically interested in her or offered her help at different times. Some described her in glowing terms, others spoke bitterly of conflicts. Yet after each round of questioning, alibis held or stories checked out. The investigation consumed enormous resources without producing a clear suspect. The city itself made the case harder still. Los Angeles was crowded with veterans returning from war, new jobs in aerospace and entertainment, and a restless social culture revolving around cafes and clubs. Short moved through this world seeking stability, but what she often found were men whose expectations soured when she did not return their interest. This pattern gave police reason to consider nearly every man in her orbit a potential threat, broadening the investigation to a degree that slowed progress at every turn. Hansen remained the figure who drew the most attention. The combination of his status, the rejection detail from Toth, and the address book entry kept his name alive in discussions. Yet the frustration for investigators, and for the public following the case in newspapers, was that Hansen never shifted from suspicion to accusation. He lingered as someone who seemed plausible, perhaps even likely, but never definitively tied. Hansen continued running Florentine Gardens even as detectives tried to connect him. He never faced charges, and there was never enough evidence to move a case forward against him. Beyond Hansen, other men from Short's past filled investigative reports, from fellow drifters she had lived alongside in cheap apartments, to servicemen she had courted in letters, to individuals she had met at clubs. Each was interviewed, checked, and then released. Some had complained about her evasiveness when she disappeared to stay with someone else. Others described arguments or moments of tension. Yet one by one, their timelines cleared after closer review. What remained after weeks of questioning was a long list of suspects and no person left standing with credible evidence against them. The futility wore on detectives. The murder had demanded immediate attention, and public pressure was intense, but with no direct witness, no traceable weapon, and no physical evidence linking any one person, each promising lead collapsed under scrutiny. Newspaper stories highlighted the growing list of men questioned, but headlines had no satisfying conclusion when each was cleared. It left the public wondering whether the killer walked among those names anyway, skillfully avoiding detection. For police, it meant frustration. Hansen's case illustrates the difficulty at the heart of the investigation. On paper, he embodied motive and opportunity. He was a man of means. He wanted more from Short than she was willing to give, and he had a direct presence in her life. Yet motive without evidence was speculation, and evidence without proof remained meaningless. Detectives chased rumors tying Hansen more closely to her disappearance, but nothing materialized. He stayed tangled in the case through circumstance, not certainty. By early February of 1947, police had interrogated a wide circle of Short's contacts. They were no closer to an answer than the day her body was found. The list of suspects reflected how precarious her life situation had been, dependent on others, surrounded by acquaintances rather than trusted friends, and vulnerable in ways that left her isolated at the worst possible moment. The investigation showed how easily people around her might have been connected, and how difficult it was to prove responsibility among them. The sense of futility became clear. Each new lead raised interest, only to collapse into another dead end. Detectives faced both the burden of public expectation and the weight of a case that resisted clarity. From Hansen to the long roster of other men, the absence of a direct connection left suspicion floating without anchor. As the weeks slipped away, investigators realized they were losing momentum. Clearing so many potential suspects did not narrow the field in any meaningful way. Instead, it widened again and again as new rumors and false confessions poured in. Without hard evidence, the circle of men questioned came to represent not progress but exhaustion. And out of that exhaustion, detectives faced the problem of wasted time as false leads pulled them even further from the truth. As the shock of Elizabeth Short's murder spread, the case began to attract not only suspects but also people seeking attention. The city was on edge, and every fragment of information about the Black Dahlia drew immense curiosity. It did not take long for opportunists to insert themselves into the story. Some claimed to have seen or heard something, while others went further and confessed outright to killing her. At first, police had to treat each statement seriously, but the more they listened, the clearer it became that many of these confessions were far removed from the truth. Part of what fueled this wave of false leads was a reward. $10,000 was offered for information leading to the capture of Short's killer. In post-war Los Angeles, that sum was a fortune, enough to push both desperate and dishonest individuals to try their chances. Detectives had hoped the money would encourage genuine witnesses to come forward, but instead the announcement turned the case into a magnet for fabrications. Within days, calls and letters poured into the LAPD. Some claimed hidden knowledge of the crime, while others simply walked into police stations and declared themselves guilty. By the time the initial storm had slowed, more than 60 individuals had confessed to the Black Dahlia murder. Men and women, young and old, walked into precincts proclaiming guilt. Nearly every story collapsed under questioning. The problem was not just the number of claims, but how inconsistent they were. Some said they strangled Short, others claimed they stabbed her, and still others insisted they beat her to death. The autopsy had already confirmed the real cause of death, allowing investigators to dismiss most accounts quickly. Yet the sheer volume of confessions forced police to spend valuable time and energy sorting through them. Patterns began to emerge. Many confessions came from those seeking attention, often repeating lurid details taken straight from newspaper coverage. Detectives noticed how these stories mirrored press leaks almost word for word. In other cases, mental illness was a factor. Individuals suffering from delusions arrived convinced they were responsible, even when timelines and evidence proved otherwise. These cases were handled with care rather than anger, but each one drained resources. Every confession required time to record, investigate, and eventually dismiss. Some stood out for their strangeness. One man claimed he killed Short after meeting her in a bar, yet he could not name the bar, describe her clothing, or explain the mutilation. Another said he had attacked her in anger after rejection, but his work records placed him in another state at the time. A woman even told detectives she had taken Short's life because voices compelled her. She, too, was ruled out, but still added to the growing pile of false leads that clogged the investigation. For the LAPD, this chaos was infuriating. Every confession had to be treated as though it could be genuine. Detectives often spent days retracing the steps of claimants before proving they had no connection. This diverted attention from stronger lines of inquiry, such as examining her last known contacts or pursuing forensic leads. In the fragile early weeks of a homicide case, such delays almost certainly damaged the chance of preserving vital evidence. The high-profile nature of the crime only worsened matters. Newspapers had transformed Elizabeth Short into the Black Dahlia, and repeated graphic details that allowed nearly anyone to craft a shallow confession. The more the press sensationalized the case, the easier it became for imposters to imitate pieces of the story. For detectives, this cycle was exhausting. Each hoax had to be documented and dismissed, consuming hours of paperwork, manpower, and public resources. Meanwhile, the city itself was gripped by fear. Women in particular were shaken by the brutality of Short's death and the absence of an identified suspect. Los Angeles nightlife became charged with suspicion. Rumors spread quickly, fueled by headlines suggesting the killer could be a doctor, a stranger from out of town, or someone already within Short's circle. Anxiety deepened further as word spread that supposed killers were walking into police stations to confess. To most residents, there was no way to know these were false. The press heightened the confusion. Headlines rarely distinguished between confirmed facts and invented claims. Some newspapers ran stories about suspects before detectives had even verified their names. Others published interviews with people who later admitted their confessions were lies. Instead of clarifying, the press amplified the disorder. Hoaxes, speculation, and rumor blurred together into background noise that made it increasingly difficult for the public to separate truth from fabrication. This confusion eroded trust between the LAPD and the city. Residents questioned why such a major case seemed to drift in circles. Each confession reported in the news looked like progress. But when the suspect was inevitably cleared, skepticism grew. Detectives complained about press interference, yet the public saw only police failure. The result was mounting tension, citizens demanding answers, detectives buried in false reports, and reporters fueling the cycle for sales. What might have been a vital breakthrough, the reward meant to shake loose hidden facts, turned into a costly distraction. Instead of leading to the killer, it wasted weeks. In homicide investigations, the first days are often the most crucial. Evidence is fresh, witnesses can recall details, and suspects are more easily found. By the time detectives had dismissed the dozens of false claimants, precious time had slipped away. Short's final movements and her true connections had grown colder with every false lead. For investigators, the frustration lay not only in the hoaxes themselves, but in what they represented. The Black Dahlia had grown larger than a single crime. She had become a public figure through relentless coverage, and her murder had turned into a stage where attention seekers and unstable voices sought a role. Instead of bringing clarity, the spotlight blurred the case so deeply that detectives spent more energy untangling lies than pursuing the real killer. By the end of the first wave of false confessions, the LAPD had lost both public trust and valuable investigative time. The reward had failed to uncover a witness with genuine knowledge. Instead, it revealed how powerfully the case had captured imagination and fear. What began as a strategy to catch the murderer had instead shown how difficult it would be to cut through the noise. With the stack of false claims finally pushed aside, detectives made a critical shift. They turned back to the one piece of evidence that could not lie: the autopsy. If the confessions had been a distraction, the physical wounds pointed toward a skill set. Investigators began to consider the possibility that the killer was not just any man, but someone with professional training. Investigators soon realized that the condition of Elizabeth Short's body posed one of the most perplexing questions of the case. Who could have separated a human body with cuts so precise, so clean, that they almost appeared to mirror a textbook surgical procedure? It was not the kind of mutilation that suggested anger or loss of control. Instead, it was systematic. The separation occurred at anatomical points surgeons were trained to use, avoiding jagged tearing or botched angles. This detail alone reshaped the conversation. Detectives began to wonder whether the person responsible had a background in medicine, or at least significant knowledge of anatomy. According to the coroner's official report, the division of Short's torso from her lower half had been carried out with close attention to technique. This was not amateur work. Investigators immediately requested lists of students from the medical school at the University of Southern California. They questioned both current interns and recent graduates, checking hospital rosters and following up with young men who had trained on cadavers. Surgeons from hospitals across Los Angeles were quietly scrutinized as well. Some interviewed directly, others checked through their schedules for signs of absences during the narrow period between January 9th and January 15th. This search reflected a growing belief that the murderer may not have acted alone in brutality but also in skill. Detectives understood that cutting cleanly through pale bone and soft tissue was not something just anyone could accomplish in a matter of hours. Even butchers, who were experienced in carving animal carcasses, might not demonstrate the same exact techniques trained medical professionals used on the human body. That pointed suspicion strongly toward those who had practiced dissection, whether inside a hospital, operating room, or in classes for medical students. Names collected from university records piled up, producing yet another set of suspects to sift through. The theory of a medical man as killer carried a strong cultural force in post-war America. At the time, doctors held both power and distance in the eyes of the public. Families trusted them with birth, illness, and death, sometimes placing life in their hands with total confidence. The idea that such knowledge could be turned away from healing and directed towards sadistic violence was terrifying. Period newspapers, then as now, often amplified that fear. They reminded readers that someone trained to save lives might, under unseen motives, destroy them with a precision few could match. This atmosphere made the suspicion against doctors particularly unsettling. As investigators pressed interviews, they were confronted by one glaring problem. There was nothing physical to connect a doctor or a medical student directly to the crime. Despite the careful cutting, no tools had been recovered, no surgical instruments linked to the murder. There were no bloody coats, no stolen supplies, no missing scalpels that suggested a direct tie. Interviews with medical students often produced firm alibis from classmates, professors, and colleagues. Surgeons at local hospitals pointed to scheduled shifts recorded in hospital logs. Even if the cutting resembled surgery, no piece of hard evidence attached that skill to a single individual. This gap left detectives frustrated. The case files now contained page after page of interviews with young men in training, as well as older professionals, but each lead collapsed when checked. The theory of medical involvement remained persuasive, but it could not be confirmed. It began to drift into the background as authorities shifted attention to other theories. Some within the Los Angeles Police Department considered the possibility of organized crime, suggesting that mutilation might have been a message killing. Los Angeles had a history of racketeering and quiet mob influence, and while the Dahlia murder was unusual in its display, some detectives did not want to ignore the possibility. Others argued the case might not require a skilled surgeon at all. They suggested that a lone killer, studying from anatomy manuals or practicing informally, might achieve something close to a clinical cut. These skeptics argued that the assumption of a doctor was too neat, too easy, and it distracted from broader possibilities. Still, newspapers clung to the idea of medical precision because it heightened the horror and gave an identifiable figure for readers to imagine: the cold physician with secret darkness behind a white coat. Yet the suspicion of medical involvement never completely disappeared. Decades later, the name of George Hodel, a doctor practicing in Los Angeles during the late 1940s, would resurface as one of the most heavily debated suspects. His own son, a former Los Angeles Police Department detective, accused him posthumously of committing the murder, pointing to circumstantial links such as surgical knowledge, location near where Short was last seen, and even private conversations caught on surveillance years afterward. While none of this evidence proved guilt to the satisfaction of modern authorities, the very fact that a doctor remained embedded in the list of leading suspects showed how strongly that theory lingered. George Hodel's case captured attention partly because it combined the elements detectives had long suspected: professional training, social connection to Los Angeles elites, and a reputation clouded by scandal. Whether or not he truly killed Elizabeth Short, his name became tied to her story. Historians and authors repeatedly returned to him, recycling the original suspicion that someone with medical expertise had carried out the crime. To them, Hodel represented the long shadow cast by that one conclusion: the cuts had been too precise for chance. Through the years, other lines of theory grew, linking Short's death to lone killers, drifters, or opportunistic predators taking advantage of her vulnerable lifestyle. But competing with those theories was always the image of the doctor killer. It survived not because investigators ever proved it, but because the facts of the autopsy never lost their force. Even for those who believed organized crime or a wandering murderer was responsible, the surgical approach to her dismemberment demanded explanation. That is why, long after the Los Angeles Police Department finally set the case aside, the suspicion of a medically trained hand continued to haunt the story. Though every doctor investigated at the time was cleared of wrongdoing, taking the suspicion off professionals never fully convinced the public. The uncanny neatness of the cuts just seemed too exacting, too informed to dismiss entirely. It created a tension between fact and possibility, what the investigation could prove and what people continued to believe. In the end, the theory of medical involvement joined the long list of unanswered possibilities. It shaped nearly every stage of discussion, influenced the suspect lists, and gave the case one of its most enduring myths: that behind the Black Dahlia stood not only cruelty but skill. With no guilty party identified, the suspicion of a doctor or student became part of the unsolved legend itself. And so, while Elizabeth Short's death never produced a trial or conviction, it produced an enduring question: had a trained professional carried out one of the most shocking murders in city history? That question has lingered across generations, surviving in books, whispered theories, and cultural memory. By the time investigators shifted their focus elsewhere, the answer had already slipped beyond proof. Without resolution, the murder of the Black Dahlia passed quietly into the territory of legend, where it has remained ever since. By 1950, the Black Dahlia investigation had slowed to a crawl. What began in 1947 as one of the most publicized murder cases in Los Angeles history had collapsed into unsolved frustration. 3 years earlier, crowds had gathered at the crime scene, newspapers had filled front pages with speculation, and the Los Angeles Police Department had thrown every available detective onto the case. Yet despite the intensity, and despite the resources spent chasing tips, no charges ever stuck. For detectives assigned to the case, the absence of closure became heavier with each passing year. During the first wave of inquiries, police had interrogated an extraordinary range of suspects. By official count, hundreds of individuals were questioned. Names came from her address book, from her circle of acquaintances, from men who had passed through her life briefly, and even from anonymous tips phoned into police stations. Thousands of leads poured in. Some were built on rumors from barrooms, others from innocent chance encounters. By the first anniversary of her death, law enforcement had investigated every tip that promised significance. Not one had produced the evidence needed. The case file grew larger, but clarity never emerged. The lack of progress did not sit well with the public. The brutality of the crime demanded action, and newspapers had created an expectation that a shocking case would produce shocking revelations. Instead, as weeks turned into months, the public began to view the investigation as ineffective. To restore some confidence, a grand jury review was called. This review examined how the case had been handled, whether leads were properly managed, and whether the police had been disciplined in approach. It was a measure of just how much pressure authorities faced at the time. Detective Harry Hansen, one of the lead investigators, reaffirmed his belief that medical expertise played a role. His testimony suggested the department had not ruled out the theory that someone with surgical training had committed the crime. This was consistent with findings at the autopsy. But the grand jury did not bring police closer to identifying a specific suspect. Hansen's words reflected the lingering suspicion that the killer had unusual knowledge. But suspicion alone did not satisfy the public hunger for resolution. The hearing underlined how little progress had been made. Out of the pressure grew something unexpected. The failure to close the Black Dahlia case contributed to new laws in California. One measure required sex offender registries, a response to public fear and frustration. Politicians pushed for more oversight of crimes with sexual elements, believing that organized records might prevent future brutality. The fact that Elizabeth Short's murder helped shape policy showed its cultural weight, even in the absence of justice. The memory of her death influenced the way California tracked offenders for decades afterward. The case had also exposed a weakness within the department itself. From the beginning, the Los Angeles Police Department had struggled with how the press shaped the story. Media outlets regularly published details before investigations could confirm them. Arrests and false confessions often appeared in headlines before detectives had sorted fact from invention. By the time police issued clarifications, readers had already accepted distorted versions. This imbalance cast the department as reactive, unable to steer the narrative while reporters dictated the public understanding of events. Some within the Los Angeles Police Department admitted the issue openly. Sergeant Finis Brown, involved at the time, criticized how newspapers worsened their efforts. Information was printed faster than police could react, and secrecy in building the case was undermined. Detectives found themselves questioned not only by superiors, but by journalists asking for explanations about theories never meant for the public. This dependence on controlling the narrative became as draining as the actual legwork of interviewing witnesses and checking alibis. While the crime itself shocked the public, the secondary story was how the police seemed tangled in the media's grip. As the years passed, enthusiasm for the case eroded inside the department. Resources waned. Detectives assigned in the early months rotated to newer responsibilities. Fresh cases that demanded attention immediately. Murders with clear suspects needed quick resolution, while the Dahlia file sat unsolved, still consuming hours without producing results. The lack of fresh leads discouraged allocation of manpower. By the late 1940s, the commanding officers began funneling investigators away, acknowledging privately that chasing breakthroughs in the Black Dahlia murder was increasingly less realistic. The cultural moment had shifted too. Other crimes, rising waves of organized crime investigations, and political corruption scandals competed for public attention. The sensationalism of the Black Dahlia began to fade from daily headlines, even as her memory lingered in whispers and occasional anniversary articles. Each time the case resurfaced, attention rekindled briefly, only to disappear again when no new evidence surfaced. To detectives, that cycle captured their frustration. They knew public outrage would return, but they also knew there was little more they could offer. By early 1950, the pace of investigation had slowed so much that cold case became a fitting description. Leads were rare. The few tips that arrived came from distant locations, long after Short's death. The chances of finding new witnesses diminished with time. Memories faded, people moved, stories shifted. Physical evidence, already scarce, offered no breakthroughs. The files that remained were records of failed leads, incomplete confessions, and suspects who had all been cleared. The case file, once active and piled daily with new papers, was now static. Yet while the investigation itself cooled, the cultural shadow of the case did not. In Hollywood, books began to reference Short's murder. Screenwriters shaped fictionalized stories influenced by the Dahlia. Crime magazines continued publishing articles speculating about the killer's identity. Even if the police had laid the case down, storytellers continued to pick it up. That was how the Black Dahlia transformed from a single unsolved murder into an enduring piece of American crime folklore. Detectives accepted that official closure might never come. Evidence had not been preserved in ways modern cases demanded, and each year the chance to link the crime to someone real diminished further. Still, talk of the Dahlia seeped through police stations. On anniversaries, younger officers sometimes asked veterans about the case. For the Los Angeles Police Department, the Dahlia represented both an unsolved nightmare and an ongoing reminder of institutional error. The failure to control evidence, to protect the investigation from media distortion, and to close the case haunted their reputation long after public anger calmed. By the early 1950s, the answer was clear enough inside the department. The Black Dahlia file was no longer active. It had settled into permanent cold case territory, surviving only in memory, stored paperwork, and occasional reviews when public interest flared. Elizabeth Short remained without justice. Her killer remained unknown, and Los Angeles carried the burden of one of its most infamous, unsolved crimes. While the case had ended formally as an investigation, its influence did not fade. Instead, it grew into legend. The unanswered questions invited speculation, preserving the story through novels, films, and whispers across the city. The unsolved nature became the very feature that kept it alive. Even as officers closed the active file in the station, the surrounding world opened it wider, keeping Elizabeth Short's murder alive for decades in ways police never anticipated. Decades later, one question still follows the story of Elizabeth Short. Who killed her? 70 years have passed since that cold morning in Los Angeles, yet the mystery remains frozen in time. Unlike other cases where the trail goes cold and stays that way, the Black Dahlia has lived on, not only in police files but in endless theories about the killer's identity. What makes the case unique is not just the crime itself, but how people have continued to revisit it. Each generation finds reasons to keep asking if the truth might still be uncovered. One of the earliest and most obvious suspects remained Mark Hansen, the wealthy nightclub owner. His connection to Short was based on her brief stays in his home, his name in her belongings, and the story that he wanted more from her than she was willing to give. Hansen maintained alibis and was never charged, but he lingered in public suspicion. The idea of a powerful man, rejected and humiliated, seemed plausible motives for some. Yet without direct evidence, Hansen went on with his life, while questions about his possible involvement remained etched into the background of the investigation. The list of suspects grew wider as years passed. Organized crime became another theory. Rumors floated that Short may have crossed paths with men tied loosely to gambling or racketeering operations in Los Angeles. These theories pointed to her vulnerable social standing, her tendency to rely on acquaintances, and the risk of trusting people she barely knew. Some thought her death might have been staged as a terrifying symbol, a warning embedded in the careful positioning of her body. But again, no trail led police closer to organized groups. The idea stayed alive as cultural rumor more than fact. The most persistent theory to survive came decades later, tied to a man named George Hodel. Hodel was a physician in Los Angeles at the time of the Dahlia murder, known not just for his medical career but for his controversial personal life. His name re-emerged in the late 1990s when his son, Steve Hodel, a retired Los Angeles Police Department detective, began publicly stating he believed his father had committed the murder. Steve presented a combination of circumstantial evidence that he argued pointed directly to George. Among those claims were alleged photographs that appeared to depict Elizabeth Short, though experts have disagreed over whether the woman in the images was her. Steve also cited comments recorded during a later police surveillance of Hodel's home, where his father made cryptic remarks about killings and police investigations. To Steve, these were informal confessions. He tied those remarks back to the Black Dahlia, suggesting his father had both the medical knowledge and the proximity to carry the crime out. Another piece offered by Steve involved cement sacks found near the lot where Short's body was discovered. Witnesses in 1947 recalled empty bags at the site, and decades later, Steve argued those bags matched the kind George Hodel used for home renovations. It was not physical proof, but in his view, it added one more thread linking his father to the scene. This web of circumstantial details has convinced some readers and drawn widespread interest in books and media projects built on Steve's claims, but official investigators have never accepted those conclusions. Both the Los Angeles Police Department and historians studying the case remain skeptical. None of the evidence presented constitutes direct proof. The photographs have been debated, with experts split on whether they picture Short at all. The taped remarks, while strange, are not a clear admission, and cement bags, a common enough item, lacked any physical identification tying them to George Hodel specifically. For law enforcement, Steve's theory is compelling in narrative, but not definitive in a courtroom. Skeptics have also pointed out the risk of personal bias, noting that Steve was motivated by a complicated family history. That skepticism has not dampened public fascination. George Hodel's name became almost interchangeable with the Black Dahlia in modern discussions. Books, documentaries, and even dramatized series have returned again and again to the debate about whether he was the true killer. Each new telling pushes his name further into cultural recognition, even when police stand firm that the evidence is inconclusive. The fascination is less about certainty and more about the possibility. People are drawn to the idea of a hidden killer living among Los Angeles' elite, someone connected to medicine and art who carried darkness in private. Outside of courtroom-level suspicion, the story of the Black Dahlia has transformed into cultural folklore in Hollywood. Her image is linked to the city's darker side, appearing in novels, films, and crime histories that focus on glamour and brutality side by side. She has become part of the same mythology that surrounds other legendary Los Angeles stories, where fame and violence mix and leave questions without answers. Much like the cases of Jack the Ripper in London or the Zodiac Killer in California, the lack of closure is what ensures survival. The mystery endures because it was never solved, because speculation is the oxygen that keeps it alive. The contrast between Short's actual life and the life imagined by the public widened further over the decades. In reality, she was a 22-year-old who had moved constantly, mostly between boarding houses and temporary jobs. But the Black Dahlia mythology painted her as a dark starlet drawn into the underbelly of Los Angeles. In that way, myths about her life became as famous as her death. The press created the first distortions in 1947, and over time, books and films repeated them until they took on a life of their own. In the end, even those who study the case often see Elizabeth Short less as a person and more as a symbol of Hollywood's most haunting unsolved crime. The tension between truth and story is what makes the mystery so difficult to untangle. Were Hansen, Hodel, or another man the real killer? Was organized crime involved, or was it the isolated act of a lone predator? We cannot know. What remains is a collection of circumstantial theories, none strong enough to carry a conviction. What does exist is the enduring image of the Black Dahlia herself, part victim, part legend, written into Los Angeles as both a caution and a fascination. And so the Black Dahlia remains unmatched as both an investigation and a story. The facts may sit still in police archives, but the narrative moves restlessly through culture, adapting with each new generation that studies her death. It is this dual identity, unsolved crime and cultural tale, that ensures the case may never truly end. The records may tell us the investigation is closed, but the story will never be. If the truth were ever uncovered today, it would change more than a closed case file. It would alter a legend that stretched for decades, one that shaped how Los Angeles saw itself and how the world saw Los Angeles. The question of what that truth might mean remains just as open as the case itself. Welcome. On today's true crime episode, we have a story that is a bit more recent. In 2021, 22-year-old Gabby Petito disappeared and was found dead later. But before we start, please like the video and leave a comment down below what time it is, wherever you are right now. Let's get to it. A young couple driving across America in their converted van looked like they were living the dream. Their smiling posts, shared sunsets, and carefree lifestyle seemed picture perfect. But within weeks, one of them would vanish and never come home. How does a love story, documented for the world to see, unravel into one of the most widely followed true crime cases in recent history? Today we step inside the final days of Gabby Petito and the chilling timeline that raised questions no one could ignore. From the outside, Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie looked like a couple living every 20-something's dream. They converted a small white van into a roaming home and set off across the country, posting clips of their travels along scenic highways and through national parks. Their uploads showed mountain backdrops, desert landscapes, and quiet camping spots far from the noise of the city. Together, they presented the kind of freedom that millions of people scrolling online imagine for themselves. It was simple, cheerful, and styled as if they had managed to escape the routines that tie most people down. To their audience, it looked effortless, yet careful choices shaped every image they shared. The world saw smiles, tender moments, and laughter, while anything less appealing quietly stayed behind the camera. Gabby herself was at the center of much of this online presence. Friends knew of her love for sketching and crafts, but online, she presented her artistic side through editing, photography, and digital design. She practiced yoga and often talked about how it kept her balance while traveling. These pieces of her life fed into the picture she showed online, where she combined footage, music, and text to create an appealing story of two young people testing life on the open road. Viewers often commented that she seemed at ease and approachable. In a world where much social media feels polished, hers struck many as personal and close to real. She filmed small details like cooking meals in the van or stretching on a blanket under the sun. These weren't staged celebrity productions. They were modest clips, yet they gave followers a feeling of connection. Her audience grew slowly as she shared short updates of the trip, hiking through canyons, walking barefoot across sand, or laughing as rain fell during a picnic. She highlighted experiences that her generation seeks online for comfort and escape. Many saw her as someone trying to live life fully, rather than just chase money or possessions. There was a sense of youth and freedom layered into every upload. She interacted with people who commented, adding notes or quick thanks, which built a tone of authenticity. This style of engagement encouraged strangers to think of her not as a distant influencer, but as a peer, the type of person you might meet while camping or walking through a small-town coffee shop. To an outsider, it seemed she had struck a rare balance between building an online following and staying honest. Brian often appeared beside her in videos and photos, adding to the couple dynamic that became part of the story. They kissed in sunlight, held hands during walks, and laughed together while driving down long stretches of highway. He carried props or pointed out landmarks as she recorded. Viewers assumed they shared the same outlook. Together, they looked like two young adults who had decided love and adventure mattered more than the stability of an office job or permanent residence. Their entire project rested on this crafted image of harmony and exploration. To view their posts was to buy into a vision that many followers aspire to. Travel with someone you love, share it online, and live without the weight of routine expectation. But as strong as the narrative appeared, everything people saw passed through careful curation. That meant that difficult moments, arguments, stress from sharing a tiny living space, and fears about the future did not appear. Social media, by design, often showcases highlight reels rather than the full story. In Gabby's case, this difference became tragic because the public assumed the dreamlike tone matched the reality. Behind the screen, though, tensions grew that no snapshot or video revealed. Any doubts were hidden by the glow of golden hours and relaxed smiles in their posts. These gaps mattered because the parts that never made it online turned out to carry far more weight than the cheerful moments left in. For those watching from afar, there were no hints of distress. Posts continued to share trails, camp meals, and creative sketches. People trusted the version they were given because Gabby herself came across as transparent and responsive. She answered comments about destinations, offered tips, and laughed at light-hearted messages. Her online persona therefore stood not as a wall between her and her audience, but rather as an open channel. She seemed like a modern peer documenting a lifestyle and letting others see it unfold naturally. It was this perceived sincerity that kept viewers invested, treating every new upload like catching up with a friend's journey. Ironically, the stronger this connection felt, the more shocking it became later, when evidence showed how different life inside that van truly was. When someone builds a following based on relatability, the expectation is that the camera reflects truth. In Gabby's story, that assumption obscured the reality. In adjusting lighting, cropping a shot, or choosing which clips stayed in the final cut, She, just like any creator, was editing her life for public view. There was nothing unusual in it, but the stakes changed because what was hidden wasn't simple imperfection. It was danger. Many later pointed out how stunning the difference between her sunny posts and the police body camera recordings from August became. But at the time, no one suspected a darker side existed. The followers saw her devotion to art, yoga, and travel. They saw vacations turned into lifestyle. They saw someone carving meaning out of movement. That was enough to make her admired, even envied. The irony of this stage is how normal it all looked. In fact, that very normalcy heightened the shock when things went wrong. Nothing about the early months suggested a path that would end in tragedy. An innocent road trip, presented to the world in soft colours and joyful moments, became the stage for events few could imagine. The backdrop of wide deserts and forest trails, the van she decorated, the meals cooked on small burners, these details blended into the ideal of van life that has long captured online culture. It promised independence and self-reliance. Yet within that controlled narrative, warning signs failed to surface publicly. The divide between what millions saw on their screens and what actually took place within the van grew until the contrast became impossible to ignore. This is what makes the story both captivating and devastating. The project began as a celebration of freedom, art, and youth. It drew in an audience that believed in the couple's image. But while the road stretched outward into wide horizons, the private world inside narrowed under unseen pressures. The curated picture became more convincing than the truth, which leads to the central question, the one that changed everything. When did the cracks first begin to show? On August 12, 2021, a small-town police department in Moab, Utah, came face-to-face with Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie for the first time. That afternoon, a call came in to emergency dispatch about a possible domestic disturbance. A 911 caller reported seeing a man slapping a woman and chasing her up and down the sidewalk. The caller said the woman appeared frightened. For those who only knew Gabby through her cheerful posts, this detail was difficult to reconcile. Until then, the road trip had been presented as an adventure free of conflict. But this was the first documented account that pointed to another reality playing out inside the van. When police officers stopped the couple near the entrance to Arches National Park, they saw a white van swerving toward the curb. Inside, they found Gabby crying in the passenger seat and Brian behind the wheel. Their accounts of what had just happened varied. Gabby admitted that she had been stressed, explaining she suffered from anxiety and that she had struck Brian during an argument. Brian, in contrast, emphasized his frustration with her behavior while maintaining a calmer tone with the officers. Observers later noted how Gabby apologized repeatedly, saying she was sorry for losing her temper and worrying aloud about being seen as the troublemaker. She appeared distraught while Brian seemed more outwardly composed, though also visibly annoyed. The officers did not treat the situation the way the 911 caller had described it. Instead of documenting it as domestic assault, they recorded it as a mental and emotional health issue. Their decision created controversy after the case drew national attention. The public later debated whether law enforcement had missed an early opportunity to intervene. At the time, the officers appeared focused on easing tension between the couple. They spoke with both individuals separately, asked questions, and tried to assess who posed the greater risk to whom. The result of their assessment was a decision to separate them for the night, rather than take anyone into custody. Gabby was left with the van, while Brian was taken to a hotel arranged through a community assistance program. The officers told them that staying apart could give them space and calm things down. Their report noted that Gabby struck Brian first, though witnesses had described the opposite. This uneven narrative raised questions about what truly occurred on that sidewalk in Moab. Some bystanders believed they had seen Brian act aggressively. The official police report, however, leaned heavily on Gabby's own self-blame and framed her as the primary aggressor. The mismatch between witness accounts and the written documents created a cloud of uncertainty that never fully cleared. For Gabby, those hours in Moab left a heavy mark in hindsight. In the body camera recordings, she appeared overwhelmed and apologetic. She worried that she was upsetting Brian and that her emotional state was the problem. Her statements echoed a pattern many experts later recognized as common in abusive relationships, where the victim takes on blame to keep peace. Brian, on the other hand, projected irritation at the situation, but positioned himself as calm in front of the officers. This contrast between her self-blame and his controlled demeanor shaped the official outcome that night. The fact that police did not pursue domestic violence charges became one of the most criticized decisions in the aftermath. Analysts pointed out that, given the witness calls, officers could have interpreted events differently. Supporters of the decision argued police had tried to use discretion in favor of de-escalation. Either way, that afternoon recorded the first official intervention into a relationship that later unraveled publicly. It also highlighted how difficult such cases can be to interpret in real time, especially when stories conflict and one partner minimizes their own safety concerns. For Gabby's followers, these details only emerged after her disappearance. At the time, her online presence gave no indication of what had transpired. Just days after the Moab incident, she uploaded more cheerful images continuing the story of her travels. She smiled for the camera, posted updates, and appeared to move forward as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened. From the perspective of social media, the dream journey was still intact, but viewed against the footage from Moab, the smiling images took on a different weight. They became evidence of how the curated moments masked deeper problems. The Moab incident also became important later in legal debates. Petito's family filed lawsuits accusing the officers of failing to uphold duties of protection. They pointed to the decision to classify the call as a mental health issue, arguing that a more cautious approach could have prevented tragedy. The legal system continues to wrestle with that night in August, but what remains clear is that Moab represented a crack in the image of perfection that Gabby and Brian projected. Once the body camera footage turned public, viewers saw the separation between the smiling posts and the tearful roadside exchange. That August day serves now as a marker, a signpost in a timeline that moved quickly toward darker moments. The couple hit the road again the next morning, continuing west from Utah. They stopped at other parks, posted more scenic updates, and seemingly continued their wandering lifestyle. Yet, what the Moab police had witnessed hung over them, unseen by their online audience. It was both a glimpse into reality and a warning that something was no longer safe behind the couple's curated journey. From that point on, every interaction and sighting carried more weight. Each image and report from the days that followed can be traced back to that afternoon in Moab, when two different versions of the relationship appeared, the polished one shown online and the tense, tear-stained scene recorded on police body cameras. The harmony of road life had taken a visible hit. For the first time, strangers outside their circle became aware that trouble was brewing. The cracks in the foundation were no longer invisible. The only question was how soon those cracks would widen into something irreversible. And as the days rolled forward, that is exactly what began to happen, leading to the final stretch of their road trip, the last public posts from Gabby, and the haunting silence that followed when she stopped reaching out altogether. By the end of August 2021, the cross-country journey had moved from Utah into Wyoming. The couple left behind the red rocks and deserts near Moab and entered the sweeping plains and mountains that drew thousands of tourists every season. For Gabby, the trip was still being shared with her online audience. On August 25, she posted what would become her final update to Instagram. The image showed her in front of a mural, smiling in her recognizable way. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. For followers who had been watching along from the start, it looked like just another update from the road. Yet later, when the timeline was combed through carefully, that same post took on a different tone. Some noticed the caption lacked the personal warmth her earlier posts included, and others said the arrangement felt abrupt, almost as though something about it was different from her usual style. At the time, no one voiced these concerns, but later, they became a source of suspicion. The 25th marked the last confirmed day anyone heard directly from Gabby through her account. Though it looked upbeat, it stood out in hindsight for being the end. Shortly after, the couple was no longer only seen through social media edits, but through the eyes of strangers they crossed paths with in real life. In Jackson, Wyoming, which draws both vacationers and locals to its busy downtown, multiple witnesses came forward later to describe unusual behavior they had observed. According to those accounts, the pair visited restaurants and stores like any travelers would, but the mood inside those moments was far from relaxed. Several people said Brian appeared agitated, raising his voice or directing sharp words, while Gabby responded by lowering her own tone and apologizing. These scenes unfolded not in the isolation of a camp, but in public spaces where staff and customers noticed the strain. The details from Jackson added layers to the public's later understanding of those last days. Restaurant staff recalled how Gabby seemed visibly upset, offering apologies again and again, while Brian stormed in and out. These accounts suggested an atmosphere of tension escalating, a sharp contrast to the curated scenes of harmony that had dominated her uploads. In every version, strangers observed Gabby trying to smooth over conflicts in a way that echoed what had happened weeks earlier during the Moab stop. Once again, her words took the form of apology, while his stance appeared angry and restless. The repetition of this dynamic revealed a pattern. Outside of these witnesses, the road trip schedule moved forward across Wyoming. The parks stretched wide, the campgrounds scattered visitors across wooded and open areas, and the weather began its shift toward cooler autumn nights. Travelers who passed through noted sightings of their van at camping areas, sometimes recognized by the distinct markings specific to it. These chance encounters would later form part of the evidence chain, documenting how far the couple had traveled and where they had set up camp. To the strangers who saw them, they were simply another pair of young people living the van lifestyle. For investigators piecing together timelines later, each of those sightings mattered in reconstructing the trail. For Gabby's followers, however, none of that background was visible in the moment. They saw the last posted image and assumed the trip continued as planned. The images of mountains and lakes associated with Wyoming fit the adventure story perfectly. Online, there was no sign that anything had shifted. But in the real-time experience of diners, clerks, and campers, Brian's short temper and Gabby's subdued apologies filled the gaps the posts never showed. The tension described by those witnesses fit consistently with the worry visible on her face during the Moab police stop earlier in the month. The contrasting narratives, what was shared online and what was observed by strangers, sat side by side. It became clear later that while the Instagram feed showed continuity, the in-person encounters painted a story of escalation. As the days drew closer to September, that conflict seemed harder to contain. Gabby's cheerful presence still existed in the digital world, but in the physical spaces of Wyoming, towns and parks, nothing looked harmonious anymore. These conflicting portrayals caused many to wonder what daily life inside the van had become in that short stretch of time. On August 27, several witnesses recalled seeing the couple again near Jackson. Reports suggested the same uneasy pattern of behavior, him storming away, her apologizing afterward, staff watching the scene with confusion. For the people present, it was just another incident inside a busy establishment. No one then could predict the weight those moments would carry later. Once Gabby was missing, and investigators searched for any clues pointing to her final whereabouts. Each person's memory of those interactions gave context. The raised voices, the apologies, the strained atmosphere at tables meant for meals and conversation. It was during this same window of late August that Gabby's family would later state they received her final communications. To them, the shift in her texts did not align with her normal patterns of speaking. Taken together, the last upbeat post, the awkward tone of her messages, and the reports of public arguments created a stark picture of late August 2021. None of these things alone would have sounded alarms, but combined, they signaled something urgent. The days through Utah into Wyoming should have been filled with exploration, landscapes, and documentary-style updates to her budding channel. But in reality, the mounting conflict became undeniable. People who bumped into them did not see two travelers unstoppable in their dream lifestyle. They saw tears, frustration, and recurring apologies. Those who later recognized their faces in news reports understood they had witnessed tension on the edge of tragedy. This stage of the journey revealed how close the situation had come to breaking. The smiling post on August 25 now marked not just another day on the road, but the last public record of Gabby's life, as she had shared it herself. After that, everything passed through the filter of witnesses and investigators. The unraveling sped up in these final days, moving from strained meals in restaurants to the silence of no further authentic messages from Gabby. In tracing back the timeline, the Wyoming sightings became critical. They showed where conflict escalated and how Gabby herself tried to diffuse each flare-up, reinforcing her role as the apologetic one. Strangers remembered these moments vividly because of the intensity that stood out amid ordinary routines. Looking back, those accounts helped define when the story shifted from curated dream into visible fracture. And so the final section of her road trip shines not for the scenic views she once set out to capture, but for the ominous tension that ran alongside them. Her last Instagram upload remains frozen in time, while witness memories filled in the rest. With those pieces combined, the image emerges of a relationship sliding quickly toward disaster. Faced with this timeline, one question rises with a haunting chill. When Gabby's family received those final messages at the end of August, were they hearing from her at all, or had someone else written them in her place? In the final week of August 2021, something unusual emerged in the communication between Gabby Petito and her family back home. Gabby had been in constant contact throughout her trip, sending text messages with updates about her locations, her plans, and how she was feeling on the road. Her mother later noted that it was not just regular updates, but also small details, emojis, warm words, affectionate notes that made her messages distinctive. The correspondence felt like a continuous connection, even as Gabby moved from one state to the next. That connection shifted in tone toward the end of August. A few of the final texts sent from Gabby's phone looked different, and her mother immediately sensed that difference. The most striking example came in a message that mentioned no service in Yosemite. At first glance, the words seemed ordinary, an explanation many travelers give when moving through national parks. But Gabby's parents knew her general route and believed she was nowhere near Yosemite in California at that time. By then, her last known images placed her in Wyoming. The mismatch raised alarm after the fact, because the explanation did not line up with her schedule or travel plans. To seasoned investigators reviewing the evidence weeks later, that odd reference became a critical marker. It was not the kind of error Gabby usually made, since her updates had always been consistent with where she really was. The language itself did not resemble her typical style either. Families often recognize the voice behind a text, the set of words, the pacing, even the way someone phrases simple things. According to Gabby's mother, the tone was off. It was shorter, flatter, and colder than messages she normally sent. Where Gabby usually expressed emotion, excitement, or affection, these lines carried no trace of personality. They read like placeholders, as though someone tried to mimic her style but could not fully capture her way of speaking. That subtle difference may have seemed small in the moment, but in hindsight it became glaring. It was not just that single message that drew questions. The flow of her digital contact had been steady, filled with reassurances, check-ins, and loving notes. Her parents were used to hearing from her frequently, sometimes even multiple times a day, especially while traveling. By late August, that rhythm broke. The final batch of texts looked strange not only in content, but also in timing. Some came too abruptly, others contained information that made little sense given her last known movements. It was a pattern shift, and parents of adult children often recognized those shifts instinctively. The family began asking themselves whether Gabby had actually written the words at all. The possibility began to grow that Brian, having possession of her phone, sent those messages in an effort to cover time while something far more serious had already taken place. If that suspicion were true, then the final contact Gabby's family thought they had with her was never actually from her. For them, the thought of reading words typed by someone else, pretending to be her, remains one of the most disturbing details. The small glow of a text notification, once an assurance of her safety, transformed into a sign of loss. By the time investigators reviewed the full timeline, these discrepancies became central questions in the case. The texts showed up in phone records, but unlike spoken calls or video chats, there was no way to confirm who had been holding the device when they were sent. Digital traces only proved that the phone was active, not that Gabby herself was alive to use it. Without her usual phrasing and warmth, the words seemed hollow. They offered no reassurance to the family now combing through every detail, trying to make sense of what happened in those final days of August. The message about Yosemite stood out most because of its geographic inaccuracy. Yosemite National Park lies in California, hundreds of miles west of where Gabby had last been seen in Wyoming. At no point in the itinerary had she mentioned such a detour, nor had her social media suggested a shift to California. Followers of her trip traced her steps through Utah and into Wyoming, not deeper west. The introduction of that location into a text made the message look like a fabricated excuse, an awkward attempt to cut off suspicion by blaming a lack of cell service. But instead of easing tension, the oddity only increased doubt. The last verifiable point of personal contact occurred before those texts. After August 25, when Gabby posted her final Instagram photo, the gap between her authentic expression and the impersonal messages stretched wide. Her mother, in particular, held on to a feeling that something about the communication was wrong. When parents describe that unease, it often comes down to a deep familiarity with the small ways loved ones present themselves. Gabby's lightness, her playful touches, her use of affectionate words were absent. What replaced them looked empty. In the investigative record, those final texts carry sharp significance. They represent the last digital signal from Gabby's phone, but more than that, they symbolize the moment when her family's connection with her was severed. The mechanical words marked the start of silence that grew unbearable in the days that followed. As September began, her family's worry turned into full suspicion that something had gone terribly wrong. The gap between her usual behavior and the flat notes of those messages left no comfort, only concern. From the family's perspective, the absence of calls afterward made the uneasiness worse. Gabby was not unreachable for long spans of time before. Even if service failed, she routinely followed up once, connected again, showing gratitude and warmth. That pattern did not resume. After the peculiar texts, no voice calls came, no videos, no proof of life. The threads that had tied her daily life to her family vanished into stillness. That silence, more than anything, convinced them that Gabby herself was no longer the one sending those words. For investigators, contrasting these final texts with earlier communication provided insight into possible timelines. If Gabby did not send them, then by the time that phone lit up with outgoing messages, she may no longer have been alive. That potential shifted their analysis of locations, sightings, and witness reports. The chilling realization was that the family may have already lost her, even as they received what looked like fresh updates. The most haunting part of the story is how those texts became both the last thread of contact and the first major sign of deceit. On the surface, they appeared to offer reassurance by explaining away silence. Instead, they exposed a new channel of suspicion that pointed directly at Brian. If he wrote them, then he attempted to control the timeline, obscure her status, and buy himself time. In the weeks and months ahead, people would continue to analyze those short lines, wondering whether they represented desperation, manipulation, or panic from whoever actually typed them. For her family, though, the meaning was simple. Those texts were not her. They were the empty shell of communication, and they deepened the hole where her voice used to be. From the moment the final message reached her mother's phone, worry shifted to fear. When days passed, with no word at all, the suspicion hardened into certainty. On September 11, her family reported her missing, pressing the case into official records and forcing investigators to act. The strange texts were no longer just anomalies. They became key evidence that what looked like a pause in communication was actually the sign of a vanished young woman and a love story that had taken a devastating turn. On September 11, 2021, Gabby Petito's mother placed the call that shifted her daughter's absence from family concern into the national record of a missing person. That date stands as the official start of the investigation. Up until then, the strange texts and the silence afterward could have been explained in hopeful ways. Families often balance worry with the possibility that travel delays or phone issues are temporary. Yet, by the second week of September, the gap had grown too large, and the sense that something was badly wrong could no longer be dismissed. The report triggered formal law enforcement involvement, forcing local police, federal agencies, and search teams to pull together any leads regarding Gabby's whereabouts. The urgency of her family stood in stark contrast to the silence from Brian Laundrie. At the time, he had already returned to Florida, but gave no public cooperation. Police noted him as a person of interest, but without direct charges, he was under no obligation to speak. The imbalance was glaring. The Petito family pleaded for answers and shared their hope for contact, while the one person who had last been with Gabby offered only refusal. In missing person cases, time is critical. Each hour that passed made the lack of communication more concerning. For Gabby's parents, the silence from Brian was as disturbing as the disappearance itself. Investigators quickly moved to secure evidence. The white Ford Transit van the couple had been traveling in was found at the Laundrie home in Northport, Florida. Authorities seized it and began combing through its contents, documenting anything that could provide insight into Gabby's final days. Technicians examined digital devices, memory cards, and gathered fingerprints from surfaces. The van, once an icon of their lifestyle, transformed into a mobile crime scene, its interior photographed for details as small as stains or traces of hair. Inside those confined walls, investigators hoped to find any sign pointing toward what had happened between Utah, Wyoming, and Florida. The growing awareness of Gabby's disappearance was not confined to law enforcement. Community members across multiple states began recalling encounters, trying to piece together where the couple had been seen and when. Reports surfaced from fellow travelers who remembered glimpsing the van parked at campgrounds. Others came forward, describing the conflict they had observed inside restaurants or on the roadside. Each of those memories turned part of the public into eyewitnesses. As news spread, social media platforms amplified these accounts, and the small clues documented by strangers became building blocks for a timeline. In effect, an entire country began assisting in reconstructing a young woman's final journey. For police, this surge of information increased leads, but also required careful filtering. Not all eyewitness accounts could be verified, and not every online story carried weight. Yet amid the noise, some reports became crucial. Video footage from another family traveling near Grand Teton National Park revealed Gabby's van parked near a dispersed camping area. That detail later connected directly to her discovery. Still, at the time of the missing person report, investigators were pressed simply to build a chain of verified sightings strong enough to define her last hours. The urgency left little room for error. The timeline between late August and mid-September carried unsettling gaps. The last Instagram post came August 25. Strange texts followed on the 27th and 30th. By September 1, Brian had returned home to Florida without Gabby. Yet, for 10 more days, her family waited without knowing her condition. When her mother made the call on September 11, it was more than routine concern. It was acknowledgement that the silence had lasted too long, and that the person closest to Gabby showed no intention of explaining. That decision pushed the case into official channels, where missing person alerts and investigative resources far outstripped what family outreach could achieve alone. As the case gained profile, the imbalance in responses drew repeated attention. Her parents released public pleas, appearing in interviews and pressing for action, hoping media coverage would increase pressure. The Laundrie family, by contrast, refused to answer questions or provide clarity about when Brian had last seen Gabby. Legal counsel advised them to remain quiet, but the perception among the public was one of obstruction. For the Petitos, it heightened the anguish. If their daughter was missing, why would the one person with key information not try to help? That tension defined the early days of the search. Local police faced limits, but once the missing report came through, federal agencies became involved. The FBI joined the case quickly, broadening its scale. Their involvement gave weight to tasks like forensics on the van, interviews with potential witnesses, and the coordination of search areas. National exposure ballooned when mainstream media picked up the case, broadcasting Gabby's face across the country. What started as one family's desperate worry now belonged to an entire nation. Each detail, from eyewitness tips to the behavior of the Laundrie family, was dissected publicly as the mystery deepened. At this stage, what investigators knew was slim but telling. Gabby was last verifiably seen alive in Wyoming toward the end of August. Brian had driven the van back to Florida by September 1. He offered no cooperation, only legal silence. Between those 2 points lay a stretch of days where her fate remained unknown. During those days, her phone stopped producing reliable contacts, and the carefully managed Instagram account went quiet. For family and police alike, those gaps formed the most pressing questions. Where had she gone? And why had Brian returned alone? Community involvement, while not always precise, illustrated how collective attention could shape a case. Tips poured in at a rate rarely seen for missing persons, often because Gabby's story connected with the imagery of road life and the curated van journey shared online. Ordinary people scrolling on their devices now joined the story, whether by revisiting footage, checking photographs for the van, or discussing possible sightings. For investigators, it meant both an influx of possible leads and a burden of separating rumor from fact. Yet the public spotlight also meant pressure on the Laundrie family continued to increase, even as they stayed quiet behind closed doors. By mid-September, the case had expanded beyond the circumstances of one disappearance. It involved multiple states, federal agents, the national press, and a rapidly angered public who demanded to know why the primary person of interest resisted questioning. The Petito family's private fear had become a matter of American headlines, each update broadcast to millions. At that moment, the search for Gabby was fully underway, grounded in timelines, phone records, and witness accounts. And with attention building, another layer folded on top of the mystery, because soon Brian Laundrie himself would vanish, forcing investigators to split their focus between not one missing person, but two. As the search for Gabby intensified, all eyes turned toward Brian Laundrie. By the second week of September, her story filled national broadcasts and dominated social media discussions. Every new witness account, every video clip of the van, every official statement was dissected. In that spotlight, Brian did the opposite of what many expected. Instead of answering questions or making public statements, he withdrew completely. Neighbors in his Florida community watched reporters gather outside the family home day after day, while blinds stayed closed and no one gave interviews. The silence itself became part of the story. His absence at any press conference, his refusal to cooperate with police, and the quiet of his household stood in stark contrast to the distress shown openly by Gabby's family. By September 13, his retreat went further. That day, Brian left his home. He was last seen by his parents carrying a backpack, and authorities later learned he told them he was heading to the nearby Carlton Reserve, a vast and swampy area in Sarasota County. At the time, no one outside the family seemed aware of this detail. For the public following the case, Brian was still presumed to be inside his home, shielded from questions. But when days passed without sight of him, the truth became unavoidable. On September 17, his parents reported him missing. That revelation shocked both investigators and citizens watching closely. The man considered a person of interest in Gabby's disappearance was suddenly unaccounted for as well. The public reaction was swift and angry. People saw his disappearance not as another tragic twist, but as an evasion. How could the one person last known to be with Gabby suddenly vanish while her family begged for answers? Questions poured in about how long he had been gone before authorities were told, and whether more could have been done to monitor him. Already troubled by his silence, the public now viewed his absence as confirmation that he had something to hide. As anger grew, attention turned not only to Brian but to his parents, who waited several days before alerting police. Critics argued that this delay cost investigators crucial time. The Laundrie family maintained they were cooperating, yet their actions fueled suspicion in the eyes of many. Police resources shifted quickly in response. Once his disappearance was confirmed, law enforcement launched extensive searches in the Carlton Reserve. Teams of officers, K9 units, and drones worked through treacherous conditions of thick brush, standing water, and wildlife including alligators and snakes. The swamp was unforgiving, stretching across thousands of acres, where searchers trudged waist-deep through muddy terrain. Helicopters swept over tree canopies, while amphibious vehicles navigated through waterlogged tracks. The search consumed immense manpower but produced little in the early days. Each afternoon ended with no sighting, reinforcing how difficult the environment was. Alongside the physical search, scrutiny intensified over whether Brian had outside assistance. Many wondered if his parents knew more than they admitted, given the delay in reporting his absence. Others speculated he had prepared in advance, equipping himself with supplies to stay hidden for extended periods. These theories gained traction online, where amateur sleuths debated possible escape routes, shared maps of the reserve, and speculated about whether he could survive in such conditions. The lack of concrete evidence left room for speculation, but it also added pressure for officials to provide answers quickly. The mystery of his disappearance became an investigation of its own, running parallel to the search for Gabby. In terms of law enforcement, Brian's classification as a person of interest meant that if located alive, he could be questioned, but at that stage, there were still no charges. That distinction frustrated many who felt police should have restricted his movements earlier. Surveillance had reportedly been in place, but with him working through familiar surroundings and natural areas near his home, slipping away remained a possibility. When news broke that he had been missing for days before authorities were informed, outrage deepened. It raised uncomfortable questions about whether he had been given a head start. The Laundrie disappearance pushed the case into new territory. Instead of focusing solely on what had happened to Gabby, investigators now juggled two searches, one in Wyoming's wilderness where she was last known, and one in Florida's wetlands where Brian was believed to have wandered. This dual pursuit escalated public fascination and anger. Missing person stories often struggle for attention, but here, the combination of a young woman's mysterious disappearance alongside her fiancé's sudden vanishing created a narrative few had ever seen before. News outlets ran back-to-back coverage, and social platforms lit up with theories ranging from survivalist hideouts to international flight. For Gabby's family, the development was a cruel twist. Instead of narrowing focus on their daughter's whereabouts, resources now had to also track down the one person who might have given answers. The frustration was visible in their statements, urging Brian to come forward, calling on anyone with information to help. Their pleas, set against footage of searchers trekking through dense Floridian swamp, emphasized the deep imbalance. Her loved ones asked for cooperation, while his side closed ranks. The investigation's atmosphere grew charged as the days stretched on. The idea of Brian surviving alone in the swamp became harder to imagine with each failed search effort. But speculation dominated. Attention swirled around his behavior before leaving, his parents' actions, and whether he had outside help. These uncertainties fueled debate, leaving many fixated not only on Gabby's fate, but on the possibility that the last person to see her alive had managed to escape accountability. Through September, television images of officers in mud-streaked uniforms, diving teams combing rivers, and search trucks leaving the reserve each night defined the case. Reporters stationed outside the Laundrie home continued to broadcast even minor updates, replaying drone footage of the backyard and analysing family movements. Public anger had reached a boiling point as frustrations centred on why a key figure in an active missing person case was allowed to vanish. By the end of that month, the case stood at an uneasy point. Gabby's family held out desperate hope for answers, while the person of interest was being sought through some of the harshest terrain in Florida. Each detail uncovered only reminded the public of the gaps, the silence in place of explanations, the missing evidence that might clarify events, and the stalled searches yielding no relief. What had begun with a young couple's trip across America now carried the heavy, extraordinary situation of two simultaneous disappearances. This new reality escalated the stakes of the investigation far beyond an ordinary missing person case. Authorities faced mounting criticism, families wrestled with grief and unanswered questions, and a nation watched intently as daily updates provided no resolution. The van life story that once showed freedom and adventure had collapsed into a double mystery. One young woman unaccounted for in Wyoming, her fiancé equally absent in Florida. The stage now turned toward a heartbreaking discovery in the wilderness, where answers to at least part of this story finally came to light. On September 19, 2021, the search for Gabby Petito came to a heartbreaking end. After weeks of public pleas, nationwide coverage, and extensive ground searches, authorities located human remains in the Spread Creek dispersed camping area within the Bridger-Teton National Forest of Wyoming. This area had already drawn attention in the investigation because it had been linked to earlier sightings of the couple's white van, captured in footage by another traveling family. That video evidence had placed the vehicle near Spread Creek in late August, giving investigators a clear lead. When search teams concentrated their efforts there, they discovered what everyone had hoped they would not find. Spread Creek lies in a rugged and remote section of the national forest, a place that had appealed to van dwellers for its quiet and accessibility to nature. The location had dispersed campsites, unmarked and without permanent facilities, where travelers stopped to park for the night. It was along one of these unpaved stretches, near where the van had been spotted, that search units came across a body matching Gabby's description. The terrain itself reflected the environment many associated with her journey, isolated, scenic, and tied to the ideals of the van lifestyle she had promoted online. But instead of wide-open freedom, it had become the setting for tragedy. Soon after the recovery, law enforcement confirmed that the remains were indeed Gabby's. For days, her family had hoped she might still be alive, perhaps injured or missing but able to return. That confirmation stripped away all lingering chances. The announcement reverberated across the nation. People who had followed her case, complete strangers who had tracked the investigation on television or shared updates online, all learned her story had come to a violent end. The campsite that symbolized adventure now stood as the final landmark in her life. The discovery transformed the focus of the case. Until then, it had been categorized as a missing person investigation. That status allowed law enforcement to search broadly, gather evidence, and piece together timelines. Once Gabby's body was found and identified, the case shifted firmly into a homicide investigation. At that moment, the question was no longer only, where is she, but rather, what happened to her in those final hours, and who was responsible? An autopsy was conducted soon after the discovery. The results confirmed that Gabby had been killed by strangulation, with evidence of blunt force trauma also present. These conclusions ended any speculation about the possibility of an accident or natural cause. The specific findings revealed a violent, intentional act. The confirmation underscored the seriousness of the investigation, pushing the case firmly toward criminal responsibility. It also intensified a narrative that had been building. While social media had portrayed a carefree journey, the reality behind the scenes involved escalating violence. For Gabby's family, the news delivered both answers and unbearable grief. The wait had ended, but so had hope for her survival. For the millions following from afar, the autopsy details established the story as one of domestic violence leading to murder, not simply a disappearance. Viewers who had been introduced to Gabby through carefully edited videos and smiling photographs now absorbed the knowledge of the brutality that ended her life. That contrast fueled conversations across the country about unseen dangers hidden beneath seemingly normal relationships. Law enforcement returned to Spread Creek to search further, mapping the site for any additional evidence. They documented the area surrounding her remains, searched for clothing, personal items, or traces that might connect to the events of late August. Each piece of evidence mattered. The confirmed sightings of the van in that location suggested it was the final stop for the couple together. Witnesses who had provided those tips now realized their attention had been vital for narrowing the search zone. Their casual footage of a parked vehicle became pivotal in bringing resolution to a massive investigation. The transition from missing person to murder victim also shifted public discussion. Once her remains were found, theories that Gabby might be lost somewhere ended. The narrative changed into one about accountability and justice. Brian Laundrie's silence, his refusal to cooperate before his own disappearance, now carried heavier meaning. If Gabby had died by strangulation and blunt trauma, then the person last seen with her became the primary focus of suspicion. Police officially confirmed that Brian was the sole person of interest. Yet, at the same time, he was nowhere to be found, having vanished into the wilderness back in Florida. The discovery intensified anger at the Laundrie family. Many had already questioned why they had waited days to report Brian's absence to authorities. Once Gabby was confirmed dead, critics accused the family of shielding him during a critical window. Every move by the Laundries was examined and reported by media gathered outside their Northport home. The police presence grew, and the swampy Carlton Reserve, searched by law enforcement, became the second active scene in a case now spread across 2 states. Gabby's death also left a cultural impact. News outlets replayed footage of her smiling on camera, editing videos for her budding audience, juxtaposed against images of the site in Wyoming where her body was found. The contrast highlighted the vast difference between curated online life and private reality. People across the country mourned her as though they had known her personally, a reaction fueled by the intimacy of the content she had shared. Her story, spread across digital spaces, resonated in a way few missing person cases had before. The autopsy report became central evidence for what investigators pursued next. It closed the debate about whether Gabby's fate might have been accidental. It established criminal violence. That fact meant there had to be accountability, even though at that stage the suspect most closely connected to her was already missing. Her case turned into both a murder investigation and a manhunt. Searchers in Florida pursued traces of Brian, while federal authorities prepared for the possibility of charges that could only be presented if he was located alive. For Gabby's family, the confirmation meant funerals and mourning, tasks they had never expected when they waved her off on a trip only weeks earlier. Memorials spread across her hometown of Blue Point, New York, where vigils brought out crowds carrying candles, posters, and photographs. The community surrounded her family with support, even as they faced cameras capturing every step. Her name, face, and story had become deeply embedded in public consciousness. Each update about investigations into Brian or reports from law enforcement circled back to the loss confirmed in Wyoming. The discovery at Spread Creek closed the question of where Gabby was, but opened wider questions about what exactly had happened in her last hours. The violent nature of her death outraged the public and intensified calls for accountability. Detectives, FBI agents, and analysts continued to gather digital and physical evidence, but the uncertainty of Brian's location overshadowed each step. The twin searches for clarity about her final hours and for the missing fiancé moved forward side by side, each one dependent on the other for resolution. The campsite that became her final location represented the collapse of a dream. What started as a project to record love and freedom on the road ended in isolation, violence, and silence among trees and dirt roads far from home. On September 19, the search for Gabby stopped being about hope and became about justice. From that point forward, the case zeroed in on Brian Laundrie's fate, and soon on the curious discovery of his own final words, recorded in a waterlogged notebook. On October 20, 2021, search teams in Florida discovered human remains in the Carlton Reserve, the same swampy expanse where Brian Laundrie's parents had told investigators he had gone hiking weeks earlier. The reserve had been combed for over a month, with no results. That morning, after heavy rains had receded, his parents joined law enforcement in the search once again. Within hours, items belonging to Brian were located along a trail. Nearby, skeletal remains were identified, later confirmed by dental records to be Brian Laundrie. The discovery closed one part of the mystery but sparked new questions. His condition and the place he was found underscored how difficult the Carlton Reserve's terrain was. Large areas had been underwater during earlier searches, making recovery difficult until water levels dropped. The items collected at the scene included a dry bag, a backpack, and a notebook. The presence of the notebook drew immediate attention, because it potentially contained something no one else could provide: Brian's own explanation. The notepad had been waterlogged, sitting in the swamp since his disappearance, but investigators were able to preserve and examine its contents. In it, they found written confessions. Brian admitted to killing Gabby. The words offered a form of clarity about responsibility, but the details inside complicated how the public and investigators interpreted his actions. In the notebook, Brian claimed that Gabby's death was not done in cruelty, but as what he described as an act of mercy. He wrote that she had been injured and that he ended her life as a way to end her suffering. This statement immediately sparked debate. On one hand, it was a direct acknowledgement that he was the one responsible. On the other, the explanation presented clashed with the findings of the forensic autopsy in Wyoming. Gabby had died from strangulation and blunt force trauma, a violent death inconsistent with descriptions of mercy. The tension between his account and scientific findings left investigators and the public doubtful about the truthfulness of his words. Forensic investigators pointed out the inconsistencies. Strangulation is a prolonged act, requiring minutes of sustained pressure. It is not a quick or merciful action, nor did the forensic report note conditions that aligned with fatal injuries stemming purely from an accident that needed euthanasia, as he claimed. Instead, the evidence matched a scenario of domestic violence turned deadly. His account in the notebook seemed shaped more by his perspective, or perhaps his need to control the narrative, rather than by fact. To Gabby's parents, it was a painful contradiction. The confession confirmed responsibility, but also attempted to justify it in a way that conflicted with forensic reality. The existence of the notebook caused a storm of analysis. Some saw it as an admission, the clearest form of responsibility that could exist, since Brian would never stand trial. Others viewed it as an extension of manipulation, with the confession crafted to elicit sympathy for him or to soften how his actions were remembered. He had framed himself as ending suffering, not causing it. For Gabby's family, this framing was agonizing. Their daughter had lost her life in a violent manner, and yet the one chance for him to speak the truth came in the form of a document that attempted to bend that truth. Law enforcement treated the case as closed after confirmation of the remains and the notebook contents. The FBI officially stated that all evidence showed Brian Laundrie had been the sole individual responsible for Gabby Petito's death. With his death confirmed, no criminal charges could proceed. For investigators, the notebook represented as close to a confession as possible in a case where the suspect was now beyond prosecution. Yet while it solved the practical question of who was responsible, it left enormous gaps in understanding motive, sequence of events, and the exact circumstances of Gabby's final moments. The discovery of Brian's remains also shifted conversations about how he had died. Authorities concluded he had taken his own life with a gunshot wound to the head. That detail aligned with the items recovered in the area and explained why his remains were in such advanced stages of decomposition so soon after his disappearance. In effect, the confession notebook functioned as both a suicide note and an admission of guilt. It represented his final words to the world and the only direct record of his interpretation of events. The contradiction between this account and the findings of Gabby's autopsy would never be reconciled in court. The truth, therefore, remained layered. There was acceptance of guilt, but not the full story of why and how. For Gabby's loved ones, closure was incomplete. The notebook did not bring peace. Instead, it confirmed loss while adding more unanswered questions. They had hoped for honesty, clarity, or acknowledgement of the harm caused. What they received was partial accountability, shaped by distorted reasoning. The emotional toll of reading his version of events, knowing the medical evidence showed otherwise, compounded their grief. The one chance for Brian to tell the unvarnished truth ended in contradictions. The case, in that sense, did not end neatly. It closed with certainty about who was responsible, but uncertainty about the details that mattered most to family. His last words left an uneasy legacy, hovering between admission and excuse. Even in death, Brian Laundrie controlled part of the narrative by choosing what to record. That control deprived Gabby's parents of direct answers, leaving them with facts provided by investigators, but explanations twisted by Brian's perspective. This tension flowed outward into the public debate as well. People across the country discussed whether the notebook should be treated as a real confession, a distorted version, or simply a way for him to say whatever he wanted without contest. Television panels and online forums debated the significance of his chosen words. Advocates for victims of domestic violence highlighted how the explanation mirrored common patterns where abusers frame themselves as caretakers rather than aggressors. The notebook, rather than resolving the story, became another symbol of how hidden violence continues to be misunderstood or misrepresented. The contradictions highlight the limits of closure in cases shaped by intimate partner violence. Confessions cannot always be trusted. Law enforcement can establish responsibility, but the deeper human questions, why someone acts in violence, why they rewrite events in their final words, cannot always be answered. For many, Gabby's story became not only about one crime, but about recognizing those patterns of denial and manipulation that appear in abusive dynamics. The recovery of Brian and the notebook brought the criminal arc of the case to an end. Gabby Petito had been murdered by Brian Laundrie. That fact was established. But the unclear lines between truth and narrative ensured the story remained unsettled. Responsibility was clear. Motive, honesty, and context were left murky. In the aftermath, attention shifted again. away from forensic detail and into the wider impact that this case had on society, media, and the way the public now talks about missing persons and domestic violence. The trial that never happened was replaced by discourse in the public square, and with the discovery of his final words, the nation turned not just to the crime but to the reaction, asking how social media, news coverage, and cultural bias shaped the way Gabby Petito's name became impossible to ignore. The news of Gabby Petito's death did not remain a private tragedy. Within days of her remains being identified, headlines across the country carried her face. Television stations led broadcasts with her story, online outlets ran continuous updates, and social media platforms kept her name trending. Millions of people who had never met her began to follow each moment of the investigation in real time. The mix of her age, the nature of her disappearance, and the unfolding drama involving Brian Laundrie turned the case into one of the most widely covered stories in America that year. It evolved from local reporting into a national spectacle almost overnight, with interest that spread far beyond the borders of Wyoming or Florida. On platforms like Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram, the story became almost unavoidable. Accounts dedicated entirely to tracking the case sprung up, dissecting details from news conferences and analyzing footage from body cameras, witness videos, and even old posts on Gabby's own accounts. Ordinary people styled themselves as investigators, posting timelines and maps that attempted to trace the couple's path across the western states. Some discussed license plate sightings. Others brushed through hours of video content posted by unrelated travelers, hoping to identify the van in the background. The online environment turned into an open forum where anyone could contribute information, theories, or in some cases, rumors presented as fact. This shift gave the case unusual traction, but it also created sharp tension. While some online sleuths offered valuable leads, such as the family who discovered footage of Gabby's van near Spread Creek, a tip that drew investigators to the site where her body was later found, others spread misinformation. False sightings were reported, photos of unrelated vans circulated, and speculation about both Gabby and Brian often drifted into invasive directions. Friends and extended family suddenly saw their personal accounts poured over by strangers. Some users promoted conspiracies that misled the public rather than helping the investigation. The quick pace of social media blurred the line between fact and opinion, and while some insights proved useful, many others wasted law enforcement's time. The balance between help and harm defined this digital storm. On one side, millions of people felt connected to the search effort, convincing themselves their voices mattered. On the other, investigators had to filter an immense flood of unverified claims. For those directly involved, the scale of online attention was overwhelming. Families pushing for answers had to give interviews under the weight of cameras, while also watching strangers online debate their personal lives. The case had entered the stage where true crime was no longer the domain of law enforcement and journalists alone. It was now shared, analysed, and amplified by a community of millions who participated from behind screens. Alongside the sleuthing came broader conversations about why Gabby's story had received such fierce and widespread coverage compared to others. Commentators framed this debate through the idea of missing white woman syndrome. The term referred to the disproportionate attention that cases of missing young white women received from media outlets, contrasted against the limited coverage given to missing people of color, indigenous women, or men of any race. This case was not the first time the issue was raised, but the sheer volume of coverage made it a dominant part of the national conversation. Some activists highlighted statistics showing how indigenous women in Wyoming disappear at much higher rates, with their cases often ignored. Others pointed out that missing persons of color seldom gain national airtime. In Gabby's case, the mix of her age, social media presence, and the striking visuals tied to her story captured mass attention, while dozens of other active missing persons investigations received little notice. The attention her case generated forced journalists to reckon with how editorial choices create uneven narratives about whose lives are seen as urgent and whose are overlooked. The debate spread across media panels and into social commentary, turning Gabby's tragedy into both an individual case and a cultural mirror. For Gabby's family, the focus offered visibility but came at a cost. Their grief unfolded live, under flashes of cameras and endless interviews. Privacy withered under the interest of millions. While they were grateful for help in finding answers, they also endured speculation that tore apart private details of Gabby's life. Every post she had shared became evidence for strangers to analyze, often without respect for the person behind it. This phenomenon highlighted the uneasy relationship between sharing lives online and how those lives are consumed when tragedy strikes. Oversharing, or even just routine posting, turned into a permanent archive scrutinized by the public long after her death. The media storm also fueled divisions over responsibility. Some argued that the attention helped apply pressure on both law enforcement and the Laundrie family. Others criticized the spectacle for distracting from quieter cases that deserved resources too. The push and pull reflected a culture fascinated by crime stories but less comfortable examining why certain stories resonate more than others. The mixture of tragedy, romance, a road trip, and curated social media made Gabby's case compelling to the public, whether or not anyone wanted to admit why. The constant presence of her name in breaking news was not purely sensational. There were practical effects. The pressure led to faster coordination between agencies, greater allocation of resources, and even international attention. Witnesses who otherwise might not have come forward realized their stories could matter in such a high-profile case. Travelers uploaded footage, neighbors recalled details, and timelines filled in with the aid of strangers. The spectacle did not just carry entertainment value, it also influenced how the investigation unfolded. Yet that same spectacle also spread misinformation and directed harassment toward people connected with the families. As weeks turned into months, Gabby's case remained a major story despite new news cycles. Documentaries, special reports, and think pieces appeared across networks. The story no longer belonged only to investigators or her family. It belonged to an entire public that used it to examine digital culture, media bias, and the place of true crime stories in society. This level of fixation illustrated both the potential and danger of crowdsourcing investigations. Awareness could create leads, but it could also distort reality. The conversation about missing white woman syndrome in particular set her tragedy within a larger framework about race, gender, and attention in the era of constant online media. By the time Brian's notebook confession appeared, the online storm had already cemented Gabby's case in cultural memory. Millions had participated in shaping the story before the outcome was even clear. This massive involvement represented both collective interest and unresolved questions about fairness in coverage. Her story became an archetype, discussed not only for the crime itself but for how the nation responded to it. Gabby Petito's name remains linked not only to tragedy but to how digital platforms, sensational headlines, and societal bias intersect when someone goes missing. The storm of public outrage was unique in scope and highlighted how modern investigations now unfold on two stages, one in police files and one in public feeds. It blurred professional boundaries, brought useful evidence but also chaos, and forced a conversation about whose lives matter in media narratives. The combination of personal oversharing, national grief, and speculative commentary made the story more than a single case. It became a reflection of culture at large, and as the online noise rolled on, another chapter opened in more formal settings. Beyond coverage, the fight shifted into courtrooms as Gabby's family sought accountability not only from Brian Laundrie's estate, but also from those they believed failed to intervene when they still had the chance. When Brian Laundrie's remains were found in Florida, the criminal process ended before it could begin. There would never be a trial, never a guilty plea, and never the chance for Gabby Petito's family to see a courtroom verdict tied to her death. For her parents, that meant shifting their pursuit of justice into civil litigation. If criminal accountability was no longer possible, civil lawsuits became the path to answers, responsibility, and recognition of the harm they had endured. What followed was not about prison sentences, but about damages, duty, and accountability. The first lawsuit targeted Brian's estate. Gabby's parents filed a wrongful death claim in Florida, naming the estate of Brian Laundrie as the defendant. Because Brian had died, the suit was symbolic in large measure, but it also followed legal precedent that families can make claims against an estate for damages tied to wrongful actions. The Laundrie family's assets were limited, yet the judgment mattered for reasons beyond outcome. The lawsuit led to a $3 million settlement awarded to Gabby Petito's estate. Those funds were not expected to be collectible in full, but as her parents explained publicly, the money mattered less than the acknowledgement. The judgment formally recognized how Brian's actions had caused Gabby's death, placing legal weight behind the responsibility already documented in his notebook and confirmed by the FBI. Another lawsuit directly named Brian's parents. The civil filing accused Christopher and Roberta Laundrie of intentional infliction of emotional distress. Gabby's family argued that the Laundries had known of Gabby's death well before she was found, and that by withholding that information, they extended unnecessary suffering. The lawsuit alleged that while Gabby's parents searched desperately, Brian's parents chose silence and even issued statements suggesting hope she would return. To the Petito family, this silence and misleading tone caused pain that could have been avoided. The case highlighted how civil courtrooms can address harm not only through actions taken, but through choices of omission, what was withheld, and how those omissions inflicted emotional distress. The reaction to this lawsuit was divided. Supporters of Gabby's parents viewed it as valid, holding Brian's parents accountable for decisions that prolonged suffering. Others noted the difficulty of proving such claims, especially since individuals may legally decline to share information with authorities through the Fifth Amendment. Still, civil courts allow different standards than criminal ones. Proof of emotional harm does not require the same degree of evidence as criminal conviction. For Gabby's family, placing these allegations in court forced attention onto behavior they believed was unjust. Even if the outcomes were uncertain, the attempt itself demonstrated commitment to pursue every form of accountability possible. Beyond Florida, another case emerged in Utah against the Moab Police Department. That lawsuit alleged negligence during the August 12, 2021 traffic stop in Moab, where officers responded to reports of a possible domestic incident between Gabby and Brian. The filing accused the officers of failing to protect Gabby despite clear warning signs. Body camera footage showed Gabby distressed and apologizing, and yet police categorized the encounter as a mental health crisis rather than a domestic assault. The lawsuit asserted that had the officers handled the call differently, Gabby's life might have been saved. By not following proper protocols, the suit argued, law enforcement failed in their duty. The Moab lawsuit was significant because it placed responsibility not just on Brian but on institutions tasked with protection. Domestic violence experts later criticized how officers on that day assessed the scene. Witnesses had described Brian as the aggressor, yet Gabby's apologetic demeanor shifted the narrative. The officers decided on separation for the night instead of arrest or deeper investigation. The lawsuit argues this represented a missed opportunity to intervene. For Gabby's family, pursuing legal action against the city of Moab was not about blaming individuals alone, but about demanding systemic change. They wanted policies improved so that future victims in similar positions would receive stronger safeguards. These lawsuits together demonstrate how justice looks different when the suspect is already dead. Usually, families rely on criminal prosecution. In Gabby's case, that was never possible. Instead, civil court became the venue where blame, responsibility, and damages were formally addressed. The $3 million judgment against Brian's estate provided financial recognition, though money collected would likely be symbolic. The ongoing suits against his parents and the Moab Police Department continue to raise questions about duty, silence, and the responsibilities owed by families and institutions when warning signs appear. Each legal pathway has highlighted different layers of accountability. With Brian's estate, the suit confirmed his role in Gabby's death. Against his parents, the focus shifted to the emotional harm caused by their choices to withhold information. And against Moab, the suit pressed on the obligation of law enforcement to take domestic violence reports seriously, even when circumstances are complicated. In this sense, the legal battles have served as extensions of Gabby's story, turning her case into not only a personal tragedy, but a legal marker for future reform. What makes these efforts unique is the way they targeted not just individuals, but also broader systems. Family members wanted more than symbolic closure. They sought acknowledgement that missed opportunities had occurred and that those failures were not inevitable. If officers had acted differently, if parents had spoken sooner, the trajectory might have changed. That belief drove each filing and continues to shape how Gabby's case is remembered. Public interest in these lawsuits remained high because they represented the only courtroom proceedings connected to the Petito case. Without a criminal trial to follow, these civil suits became the stage where questions of duty, fault, and justice were argued. Every filing, every hearing, and every judgment received national headlines. People wanted to see how accountability could function even when direct criminal punishment was impossible. For Gabby's family, that spotlight provided a form of advocacy. Their broader mission has been to use this legal visibility to spread awareness about domestic violence as a societal issue, not just a personal story. Ultimately, the path through civil courts reflects how justice is sometimes pieced together in fragments. Emotional harm, financial damages, and institutional negligence cannot undo a life lost. Yet for families left behind, these avenues provide recognition and ensure responsibility does not disappear with the suspect's death. The filings against Brian's estate, his parents, and the Moab police all show how the Petito family pursued every corner where responsibility could be found. While no lawsuit could bring Gabby back, the actions taken kept her story active and meaningful in American courts. They shifted focus from what could no longer be achieved in criminal prosecution to what could still be recognized through civil accountability. These cases emphasize that justice is not only about imprisonment, it is also about acknowledgement and reform. Each ruling, settlement, or argument kept attention on the red flags missed and the pain caused afterward. And in following this trail through courtrooms, the story of Gabby Petito asked a final question of the public. What does her case leave behind? And how should we rethink the way safety, intervention, and honesty matter when the warning signs are there but ignored? Gabby Petito's story showed how easy it is to miss the truth behind carefully curated images. Her online life looked warm and full of adventure, yet hidden tension built into something deadly. What appeared normal on a screen did not reflect her reality. The warning signs remind us that smiles and photographs cannot always speak for themselves. Real safety requires more than outward appearances. It means listening to instincts, noticing red flags, and having honest conversations. Viewers who followed Gabby's story can carry one lesson forward: value openness in relationships and treat signs of control or fear as serious warnings.